Good afternoon. We are going to start this book launching event today. And I'm very thankful to the participants because we know that it's a kind of heat wave running. And despite this heat wave, you have come here to attend this event. And we are expecting some more participants too. And thank you very much for that on behalf of Salam, our sincere gratitude to you. I first welcome our guest, especially our chief guest and the guest of honors, to come to the dais. So first I invite Professor Rehman Sohan sir. Sir, please come to the dais. I invite Dr. Murshid Rahman, economic advisor to the Honorable Prime Minister, to come to the dais, please. And I invite Professor Siddiqur Rahman Usmani as the guest of honor also to come to the dais, please. Proxy. No, you are always there. So I have two co-editors of this volume, Professor François Bourguignon and Dr. Umar Salam. I can see Umar has joined online. Hi, Umar. You can hear us. Okay. And I haven't seen François joining this Zoom yet. So anyway, whenever he joins, we'll listen to him. So I invite them and welcome them too. And we'll actually listen from them in due course. So this book, Why is the Bangladesh Paradox Sustainable? It's an outcome of almost, I think, 2.5 years research on Bangladesh's development process. And I'm also thankful to the co-authors in some of the chapters who actually contributed to this volume, and some of them are here. Dr. Mirza Hassan, where are you? Mirza Bhai, you're here. Okay. And then Dr. Qazi Maruful Islam. I hope I saw him, so he's around, I think. Oh, yeah. Sorry. I think I'm looking at the back. Yes, sure. And Dr. Samia Haq Bidisha, she's here too. And also there are some other co-authors who are mostly they are not in country. For example, Dr. Sadiq Ahmed, he's not in the country, so he probably because of the very time difference, he could not join today. And also there are some other co-authors who could not join today. But we have kind of a set of rich and people who can make the rich discussion on this book. And I can see Dr. Jaidi Sattar here too. Thank you, Jaidi Bhai, for coming, and also some other participants. And we look forward to hearing from them. Professor Imam Akash is here too. Let me give a very brief background of this volume, and I'll try to speak very briefly about the message of this volume. So, first thing is that probably there is a big question. We have given the title, is the Bangladesh Paradox Sustainable? Actually, is there any paradox? And then when there is a paradox, and whether the question is whether it's sustainable or not. So in our volume, we try to answer that. In essence, there is no paradox as such, because we could explain how the development process in Bangladesh happened. Especially the apparent paradox emerged from the fact that the development in Bangladesh, especially if you look at the economic growth process, it happened against the very dismal performance of the formal institution, the quality of formal institution. So that was the reason why in 2006-07, World Bank started talking about Bangladesh paradox, development surprise, and some other renowned academicians also talked about that. So probably one of the reasons is the way the quality of institutions in Bangladesh were there, very poor quality of institutions. If you look at any kind of global indicators on governance and institutions, the Bangladesh is especially the emergence of the ready-made garments, the way remittance contributed to the development process, also in some cases the agricultural development, actually really contributed to not only the economic growth process but also social development. So that's why, while many sub-Saharan African countries failed to achieve certain level of development, what Bangladesh actually achieved, so that was the reason why many tried to understand or tried to pose the question: how could Bangladesh achieve this success despite having a poor governance or poor quality of institution? So that is something we tried to explain in our volume in some chapters, and then we went beyond this explanation to try to present the kind of our arguments that what is the next, what next. So I'm coming to that point, but before that, let me mention one thing. I must tell you that today Professor Wadi Mahmood, he was supposed to be here, but at the very last moment sir sent his regrets because he became kind of he's feeling uncomfortable, he's feeling discomfort because he's moving his house now, and so he sends his regrets to our guest. uh, so let me very briefly give you kind of very brief outline of the chapters. So we had one kind of overarching chapter on the institutional diagnostic project, because this was a multi-country project. It was written by François Bourguignon and Jean-Philippe Plateau. And then in the volume, the chapter one, it actually presented the kind of framework of the institutional diagnostic of Bangladesh, because this volume is a project which actually talked about institutional diagnostic. And then we had another chapter on Bangladesh's development, achievements and challenges, where we tried to understand what are the achievements so far, and then what are the broad challenges. Then the third chapter looked into the critical institutional areas for Bangladesh's development. Especially, we used different techniques. We developed different indicators using available global indicators at the one hand. On the other hand, we also conduct a survey on the stakeholders to understand the critical areas for institutional reforms or the challenges. Then the next chapter talked about informal institutions, the ready-made garment sector, and the present challenge of export diversification in Bangladesh, where we tried to explore why the diversification is not really taking place. What are the challenges? And is the RMG model of export success, can it be replicated to other export sectors? And that is something we tried to explain. I'm not really getting into the details because I encourage you to read this volume. This volume is an open access volume, and the kind of QR code is given there, so you can just scan the QR code and you can easily download the full volume. So we also got, very interestingly, in addition to the co-authors, we also got some very renowned people, academicians, to comment on each chapter. For example, on my chapter on this RMG sector, Professor Jamie D. Mello, he actually commented. Then we have a very important chapter on the private bank or political economy of the private bank governance, especially looking at the governance structure of the banking sector. So Dr. Mirza Hassan, he took the lead, and Dr. Samahak Bidisha and some other co-authors were there. And we also got Thorsten Beck, Dr. Thorsten Beck as the discussant. Then we have had one important chapter by Dr. Sadiq Ahmed on the taxation sector, where the very important challenges, serious challenge related to the reform in the taxation sector is discussed there. And we also got Christopher Hedy, Professor Christopher Hedy, as the discussant of this chapter. The next chapter talked about the public spending on, especially the institutional and the public spending, and we took the primary education as one of the case study. And where with me, Zubair Hossain and Bozlo Khandokar, we tried to explore the very institutional challenge related to the primary education sector in Bangladesh. And Dr. Elizabeth M. King, she was the discussion of this chapter. Then the next chapter was on the institutional challenge in land administration, especially related to the kind of the land management, land distribution, and then the important issues related to land reform and all the kind of institutional arrangements related to this land administration. We tried to analyze and explore those issues there. And where Professor Dilip Mukherjee, he actually commented on this chapter. Then we had one important chapter on the judiciary. And this judiciary, this one, but we tried to link it with the land disposition and litigation problems. And we tried to use that as a case study and to understand the institutional challenges in judiciary, especially some of the very serious institutional failures. Where we have, one of the authors was Dr. Qazi Maruful Islam, and also we had Rafika Ferdowsi. She contributed in that chapter. We had Jean-Philippe Plateau as one of the as the commentator of this chapter. Then finally, very finally, we had this summary, or what you call, it's not a summary, the synthesis chapter, where François, Bourguignon, me, and Umar, we contributed, and we tried to actually develop a diagnostic tool or analytical tool to understand the institutional challenges in Bangladesh. So, and very briefly, in the next few minutes, just 4 or 5 minutes, I'll tell you what actually the major findings of this research or the synthesis. So, first thing is that it appeared in my chapter in the ready-made garments sector too, that the fundamental question of what I started with, that why Bangladesh performance, or why Bangladesh could achieve certain high level of economic growth despite very dismal performance of the quality of institution. One of the explanations we offered that Bangladesh was able to create some pockets of functional informal institution for which the major growth drivers, especially the ready-made garments and the remittance, and probably you can extend it to some other, even the state actually kept its hands off on the, let NGOs to work in certain areas, critical areas. So that really helped Bangladesh to achieve this development or growth success. And if we can extend this argument, and I would say that there was a kind of clear political settlement around those growth drivers, that whatever, irrespective of the political differences, political parties or political elites, they had a consensus on allowing these growth drivers to function. And then there was a kind of, the institutional arrangements which were created for these growth drivers to perform. But the question is, that's what we really asked ourselves, and then we tried to go back to this question: what next? Can we continue the same process for getting into the next episode of growth and development process? And we said no. And that's why we said that this is not sustainable. Because what we found, the growth drivers and the dividends from the growth drivers actually are declining. So looking at the ready-made performance, the ready-made garments, looking at the performance of remittance and few others, you see that Bangladesh need a new set of growth drivers. Probably it can be special economic zone, probably it can be FDI. It can be the big infrastructural projects, which are done by the public infrastructure projects. But unfortunately, so far, there is no clear political settlement on these growth drivers. There is no clear consensus whether this should be the next set of growth drivers for Bangladesh. And then, very interestingly, the kind of institutional arrangements which were there for those old drivers to function, those institutional arrangement can't be easily replicated for the new set of drivers, can be used for the new set of drivers. You really need as I said, new set of political settlement, at the same time, improvement in the quality of institution. For example, to allow the special economic zone to perform better, to attract large-scale FDI, or even to have a cost-effective or time-effective implementation of the public infrastructure projects. So that is kind of a very, one important conclusion which can be drawn from our book. Second one is that what we also tried to argue that our industrial policy, whatever, because I'm not talking about the formal industrial policy, which is actually declared by the Minister of Industry as industrial policy, as Shilpo Niti. I'm not talking about that. So industrial policy means the kind of incentives which are created for industry to perform, and the kind of policies or acts, or even the kind of arrangements. The industrial policy, which is existing industrial policy, is actually based on what we call the deals environment. It's not really rules based, it's not very coordinated. And the major beneficiary of this industrial policy is nothing but the ready-made garments industry. They actually knew how to use this industrial policy, this environment, and some of the incentive regime or the structure was actually designed in a way that helped them. But now, as I talked about this new set of growth drivers, or if we talk about export diversification, moving away from garments to other sectors. Now, the problem is this kind of deals environment can't really help getting into a diversified export basket or a larger, if we talk about larger industrialization process. So we really need a coordinated industrial policy and moving from the very narrow deals-based industrial policy to a coordinated industrial policy. That is the second message. Third important message, we try to argue that there is a kind of ineffective regulation. The regulatory regime is not really effective. And in many cases, it is actually very defective and problematic. The cases are banking sector, the cases are taxation, the cases are even the labor conditions, the labor standards. We know that there's a serious challenge, like according to the Stromoniti or labor laws, you need to comply with certain labor standards. But when it comes to enforcement of those standards at the factory level, there are serious problems. So the problem is probably on paper, there are something very, very nice things are there, very right things are there. But when it comes to enforcement, the regulatory regime is not really capable to enforce those policies and acts. So that's what, and I have given the example, I'm quite sure my co-authors on the banking sector, on the judiciary, or even the taxation, they could actually talk about this. The final point on this diagnostic is that all this lead to a kind of a case where the questions come about the state capacity, whether we have been able to enhance the capacity of the state. There are many aspects of this question. I'm really getting into those many aspects, but two examples I'm trying to give. One is, of course, the taxation. Because it's a government to run a state to run its government, it needs to mobilize domestic resources, domestic revenues to finance its government functions. Now, if we look at the tax GDP ratio of Bangladesh, and if we look at the performance of revenue mobilization, that is really far from being satisfactory. And over the years, we are seeing a declining trend. So that poses a big question on whether the state is being able to enhance its capacity for domestic revenue mobilization. That is one thing. Even this problem is manifested when it comes to the implementation of the budget, when it comes to implementation of the annual development programs. And every year we see that, rightly so, probably an ambitious budget is proposed. But when you look at the actual implementation, actually Salim did a research, I know that some other think tanks did the same research, that when it comes to actual implementation, that the implementation actually is around 75 to 76% of the proposed budget. And why does it happen? It happens because the state doesn't have enough money to finance its very important spending. And what are the important spendings? Two critical spending, health and education, where we see in last 2.5 decades, irrespective of who was in power, that when it comes to education, public spending on education as percent of GDP, and public health spending as percent of GDP, it remained almost constant, a flat line. Education at 2%, health less than 1%. Whereas we know that if we look at the comparable countries, our competitors, Vietnam, some of the Southeast, even India, even Nepal, they spent almost 2 or 3 times of what we spent in health and education. And nobody will argue or that the kind of need for public spending on health and education for human capital formation. 2 last points, and this is something that then I will end and I will invite my co-editor, Dr. Umar Salam. 2 points. One is that one of the findings, I know that this is a bit of sensitive to talk, but I'm taking my courage from Dr. Selim Raihan. I know that he will allow me to speak on that. Corruption. So, and in terms of corruption, in the case of corruption, that what we try to argue that there is a stable corruption equilibrium in Bangladesh. It's a kind of একটা স্থিতিশীল দুর্নীতির একটা জায়গা. What do you mean by stable corruption equilibrium? That means that everywhere it's kind of, whatever actions you take, there's a counter action there, and then the status quo kind of is maintained. I'm not saying that there is no drive against corruption. Of course there are, but the counter forces are so strong that those drives are very inadequate, and it can't really change the status quo. So that's what we try to say. There's a stable corruption equilibrium, and then again, with the points I have mentioned earlier, the need for, in various areas, the kind of institutional deficiencies, there is a need for, as the economic reforms, at the same time, very important institutional reforms. Now, to break this stable corruption equilibrium and to, undertake these reforms, the problem is there's a strong anti-reform coalition. That means I know that many in the government, and as we also speak, that we need that, we are in favor of the reform, but the people or the quarters who are against reform, they're so strong that you can't really break this anti-reform coalition. Now, to get away with this stable corruption equilibrium and to break this anti-reform coalition, we need strong political will. We talk about this, and I think in many of our research and many of our analysis, we talked about that. But the problem is, a political will is not purely exogenous. It can't be something that something will come as a purely exogenous and then political elites, they will start acting on that. It's not that case. It is also dependent on the country context, the political context, the way political elites, or the economic elites, the business elites, they interact amongst each other, the kind of competition among them. All this will determine. So we can hope that our elites, they will realize this kind of institutional challenges. And of course, Bangladesh had very important success in the past, and that's what we also talked very loudly in our volume. It's in our one of very beginning chapter. But we talked about the challenges that this will hold Bangladesh's future, back. So that's something we need to be seriously aware of. Unless we undertake this reform, we can't get into the next phase of development or prosperity. So with this, I now invite Dr. Umar Salam. I think, unfortunately, I don't see François Bourguignon here online. So Umar, please take your time and then please share your views with us.
Thank you so much, Professor Raihan, distinguished guests, participants. Thank you all for attending this event. Thank you for scheduling it at such a convenient time for me here in the UK as well. Much appreciated. So Selim has given you already a very nice outline of some of the key arguments that are in this book. So perhaps it would be appropriate for me to explain the context in which the book arose and some of the key features that we tried to apply in implementing this project. So the major project from which this book arose was called EDI, Economic Development and Institutions. This was a 7-year research program led by François Bourguignon, the former chief economist of the World Bank, and his colleague Jean-Philippe Plateau. They were the research directors and generously funded by the UK government through the Department for International Development, which is now part of FCDO. This program was very broad. It tried to engage with institutions and their relationship to economic development in many senses. And there were a great range of projects that it funded. Some of these were very small. They were case studies, especially those concerned with the differences between formal and informal institutions. Others were larger. We funded some RCTs and some larger studies. But the 4 most significant studies in the project as a whole were these 4 institutional diagnostics. These were country studies in Tanzania, Benin, Mozambique, and of course, Bangladesh. And the goal of this particular part of the program was to create these index. And perhaps I could just say a little bit about what an institutional diagnostic is. It's a new thing. It's something that was designed for this project. It takes its inspiration from the growth diagnostics that have been around for 20 years or so. Originally, came out of Harvard's Growth Lab, Danny Roderick, Ricardo Hausman, Andres Velasco, the so-called HRV growth diagnostics. Growth diagnostics are trying to diagnose a question, which is, why is a country's economy not growing as well as it might do, in terms of some symptoms and some causes, which it conceives of as some constraints on a growth model, that it tries to work out which of those constraints is the so-called binding constraint, the one which, if you were to lift it, would give the greatest benefit. Growth diagnostics over these last 2 decades have become quite mainstream in development economics. And we were conscious of this method, but we wanted to do something different. Institutional diagnostics are inspired by growth diagnostics, but they work in a very different way. There are some good reasons for this. The growth diagnostics methodology is rooted in a growth model, the quite neoclassical growth model. And it's a way of explaining how institutions interact with one another. But when we think about what we really mean by institutions, which can mean things like the formal institutions that Selim was discussing in the sense of the taxation system, land rights, the judiciary, but can also mean informal institutions like social norms and networks and other ways in which people interact with one another. Well, we don't believe that there can ever be a formal model in which you say how these institutions interact with one another. So we need to have something that is much more heuristic, much more flexible, much more adaptive, because that's the nature of reality. It is more complex than something we can summarize with an economic equation. So that's one reason. Another reason is that although the growth diagnostics literature likes to compare themselves to Anna Karenina. If you remember, the opening line of Anna Karenina is that all happy families are alike and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. So the growth diagnostics literature likes to use that analogy to say that economies are all different and that an approach needs to be country specific. Well, that's correct, of course, but a growth diagnostics approach tends to take you down the same path in each case. And we know that that can't be right. We know that each country will have its own challenges and that we need to make use of local knowledge. So again, the institutional diagnostics are very much intended to be sensitive to local context and to try to find insights that are special, that need to be unearthed in different ways, and in other ways to be adaptive and flexible. So those are some of the key features of the approach. But the core idea that you're trying to diagnose a question, which in this case you could say was the title of the book, what is the Bangladeshi paradox? Is it a paradox at all? Selim has explained why perhaps it isn't. And is it sustainable? You take a fundamentally important question like that, and you try to think of all the component parts, all the economic outcomes that we are concerned with today in Bangladesh. And then we think about how those economic outcomes come about through the workings of institutions. We then examine those institutions and we look for the proximate causes, the issues with how institutions really work. And then we backtrack another level and we look at the political context in which these institutions emerge and how they control. That is the diagnostic method, if you like. As I say, it does need to be heuristic. It needs to be applied in a way that is very sensitive to the context. And most of all, I think we need that local knowledge because you cannot apply a one-size-fits-all approach to questions of this complexity. That is a little summary of the method. But I want to make another observation too about the project as a whole. This is a book produced to the highest academic standards, published by CUP, and I hope that it will be very useful for researchers, scholars, and students. But it is intended to be something more than that. And what I mean is that it is intended to be part of a debate. It is intended to help advance the discussion on policy questions that are hugely important. We think the book is timely. We think the message needs to be heard now. And we very, very much hope that we can participate in that debate, in that process, and that the book can be useful in that sense. I should say that this question of local knowledge, Selim has described already how there were many workshops, surveys, interviews, and other things, but also each of the thematic studies that made up the core research component of the book was led by teams here in Bangladesh. At the same time, EDI is a global community of researchers, and there's tremendous embedded knowledge and experience in that community. So one of the other aspects in producing the book and implementing it was to try to bring together those partnerships of local researchers and international experts who could assist on the project. I think that the formula was successful, and I very much hope that it's something that we can build on as well. I think that the success of programs like this is very much in what they do after the program has formally finished, of which today's event is an important component. I should say perhaps as well that although the questions that are raised in the book are, for the most part, economics, we are interested in economic development, you cannot hope to answer these economic questions purely by economic methods. In other words, economics depends upon history, it depends upon social change, it depends upon politics. And the book tries to weave together these interdisciplinary threads, because I don't think that you can make sense of Bangladesh's economic development without being aware of important parallel and connected processes of historical and social and political change. So the methods are very much interdisciplinary as well. I think that just to get back to the actual methods, you could say that there are three fundamentally difficult things that the book has to do. We need to understand how institutions interact with one another. These are parallel processes which have deep connections. Selim has spoken about the prime role that the industrial policy and the question of what to do with the ready-made garment sector and how that driver of growth works, how it has been successful in the past. But as soon as you start engaging with those questions of the institutions that affect that sector, you immediately start to ask about the interactions with other institutions to do with land, taxation, judiciary, banking, etc., and with informal institutions. That question of how institutions interact is really challenging, and it's one of the things that the book is trying to do in terms of its research methods. Related to that is this question of institutional change. What is it, or how is it, that institutions change? Or similarly, why is it that they sometimes don't change? As I said, the book is concerned with policy, and it does make some policy recommendations. But making policy recommendations is the easy part. If it were so easy, then we would have solved all these problems some time ago. There's a lot of consensus about policy recommendations. What there isn't consensus of is how to get there. So it's these mechanisms of change and understanding why things sometimes don't change. Selim again described the complexities of the political settlement, how there are reactions, actions, and reactions. And it's that process of change that I think is absolutely fundamentally important. And that it is not just a question to write about, but it is an activity to participate in. It is something that you need to debate, and that is why this event is important in its own right. We're not just grateful to you for honouring us with your presence, but also for engaging in these conversations that hopefully are part of that process through which change may be brought about. So I'd like to conclude just by thanking you again for your presence. Very much looking forward to any reactions or questions you may have regarding the book. And yes, just to say thank you once more. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Umar. Thank you very much. So what we'll do now, we'll have actually formal launching of the book. We know that there is a requirement to take a photo. So I'll request co-authors to come to the dais. At the same time, I also request Dr. Jaidi Sattar, Professor M.M. Akash, Dr. Munzur, and of course, Abid, you can also please come. We can actually have a photo. আমাদের সবার কাছে বই নাই, we don't have, but we have some dummies. So we learned it from sir that day. Exactly. Sir. আপনারা বলছেন আমরা স্যার আপনি স্যার আপনার চেয়ারে বসেন জাদি ভাই এটা আমি এই কোথায় Okay. Thank you. We'll get a copy. Thank you. So what we'll do now, I will invite Jaidi bhai, please don't go away. আপনারা কিন্তু আমরা যেহেতু এখানে আমি শুরুতে ইংরেজিতে I spoke in English because there are some international participants from other countries who have joined online. But I request anyone who wants to speak both in English and Bangla, so no worries. So I will first hear from 3 other co-authors, and then I will invite some other distinguished participants. So first, Dr. Mirza Hassan. Mirza bhai.
Hello. Okay. Respected panelists and audience. I was one of the co-author on the banking sector chapter particularly. So what I'm going to do, I have very few minutes to talk. I'm going to talk about 3 things. I'm not going to get into details of the chapter itself. Most of the stuff in the banking sector governance is an open book. You read it in the newspaper every day, what's happening. So there's not much hidden in terms of what is happening in the governance and the political economy of the banking sector. So, but I'm going to talk about some meta dynamics. What does it mean that the direction, the trend, the dynamics of the banking sector the way the banking sector is evolving in Bangladesh. What does it mean?
একটু কথা যদি বলা হয় আমরা খুব কৃতজ্ঞ থাকবো, কারণ একটু নয়েজটা এখানে সামনে চলে আসে। ঠিক আছে, একটু যদি আস্তে কথা বলা যায়, হ্যাঁ, অথবা নাই বলা যায়।
Okay. So in terms of larger scheme of things, where does it stand? What kind of historical role this banking sector is playing at this moment? So I'm going to talk about the meta dynamics of capitalism. Capitalism, the word is hardly used in the academic circle in Bangladesh. It's the market economy, very abstract, very ahistorical. But we live in capitalism, and capitalism has it. You don't have to be a Marxist revolutionary to talk about capitalism. Economic sociologists, they always talk about capitalism. It's a lot of interesting debates going on in the West and in many other southern countries. So one thing, if you notice in the banking sector, there is a state capture. It's been going on for some time. The private sector bankers, they are capturing the regulatory policies. They make regulatory policies as they wish. And they're being empowered over time. So that's the syndrome of state capture. The state capture has been used since early 2000 by World Bank, finally. And the way they talk about state capitalism is another, aberration in the market economy. We shouldn't have been done, like, the monopoly, like those kind of stuff. But state capture has deeper meaning too. It also means that beyond cronyism, some individual, very powerful capitalists having some favor because of the close connection with the political elites. State capture is beyond that. State capture, it cannot be only one or two individual powerful capitalists capturing the state. It has to be collective. So something is going on which is beyond cronyism. It's the collective will of the capital. So it's a consolidation. To put it in a Marxist terminology, what they call the capital logic. There are two logic. One is the capital logic, when capitalism takes over. The capitalist calling the shot. They decide what states should do, what kind of policies states should make. So that's one of looking. And there is a political logic when the political elites have some kind of degree of autonomy over the capitalist. They can rein in, they can discipline if necessary. Okay, so that would be the political logic. So the political elites will intervene to correct the course, to reduce the excesses done by the capitalists and so on. So if this is the case, that some kind of state capture. What I'm saying, the capital logic becoming predominant in the banking sector, is that a sign that Bangladesh capitalism is moving towards the direction of liberal capitalism, as in Anglo-Saxon capitalism, as in US, the extreme case, that the capitalist class are calling the shot. They decide, and it's very difficult for a politician to do much. Yeah, there are complex reasons why so. And in the other extreme, you have political capitalism. China is a very good example of that, where at the end of the day, this very powerful capitalists, the billionaires, whatever, are controlled, disciplined by the political elites. In China's case, the Communist Party as a collective. So we have these two variants. So where is Bangladesh going? So my point is that given the extreme empowerment of the banking sector capitalists as a collective capital, remember, when they talk, it's not only this particular banker or that particular banker. They come to their Bankers Association of Bangladesh. It's a form of collective capital. So are we witnessing some kind of movement towards liberal capitalism, like the US? I mean, as an approximation. I'm not saying exactly that's what's going to be. Or given the degree of cronyism and political intervention we have started, can the banking sector resolve this? The logic of political and just bring in, consolidate the capital logic or not? Time will tell. So that's one indicator. So when we look at banking sector, I think we shouldn't miss this, the larger picture. So that's one point I'm trying to make here. And there are many other points. I'm not going to go into that direction. But the transition that we are witnessing is a fragile equilibrium. We don't know what's happening, because the dynastic politics is very powerful. It's a strong barrier towards the capitalist taking over the state. So that has to be resolved at one point. The future will tell us what's happening with this dynastic politics, the last barrier for the capitalists to take over the state. So that's something we need to watch. And in the process, it's a very complex process. I don't understand it. I'm trying to understand it. It's very complex, a lot of contradictory dynamics within it. We might end up, instead of liberal capitalism, towards some kind of oligarchy capitalism. Think of Philippines in the 70s and 80s with the banking sector, the way the capitalism evolved under the Marcos dynasty, or current Russia under Putin. These are some of the likable scenario in Bangladesh. Okay, and it has implications for development, because if you have that kind of oligarchy capitalism, the whole questions of inclusivity and development will be questions, will be jeopardized. So it's not just a pure academic issue. It has, development. How much time are you allowing me? I have two more points very quick. Yeah. Okay. All right. The next point, my second point was on paradox, but I'll skip and I'll go to the third point, which is about the consolidation of the dominant party state. When this book was written, the dominant party state, essentially, it means one party calling the shot. Okay, but I want to clarify one thing very carefully, which is dominant party state it doesn't have to be democratic, it doesn't have to be authoritarian. It could be both. Okay. For example, dominant party state in Japan is 80 years old. According to the Japanese experts, it's still going on. It's still a dominant party state, the Liberal Democratic Party. Congress, India under Congress for decades was a dominant party state under Congress, democratic. Okay, these are the two good democratic examples. And then dominant party state could be authoritarian, Singapore, current Cambodia, and Bangladesh and Rwanda. So Bangladesh is an authoritarian variant of dominant party state. And dominant party state doesn't mean the party is very strong. Party can be very weak. The state can be very weak vis-a-vis the business class, vis-a-vis other rogue actors. They won't be able to do a lot. Like, as I said, on the banking sector, you can talk about many other sectors, transport sectors, the state is very weak. So it's a dominant party state, but at the same time weak. That's also possible, and that's the case of Bangladesh. Okay. And if we have, when the book was written, the research was done, it might be resolved, might be addressed, and the performance legitimacy has become very important with the dominant party state. So I think the ruling elites will feel that they need the performance legitimacy. So there will be a good impact on the development, on the inclusive development as such. Finally, I want to just quick reflection on the paradox question. It's very unfortunate that the title is paradox. Because Selim was trying to convince me that he's not a believer in paradox and so on. But I'm not convinced, because the paradox word is a brand name. It's a negative brand name that was given to Bangladesh, unfortunately, by the World Bank in 2010 report. What does it mean, paradox? I mean, Professor Wahiduddin Mahmood is not here today. I could have asked him directly, why did you think development surprised? Why did you surprised by Bangladesh development? What I mean, we need to. I mean, what is the standard? What is the model here? Is the West the model? Because this is connected with a larger epistemological question, philosophical question, whether West is the standard, whether there is a universe that we need to conform to, or we are talking about, the decolonial literature talking about pluriverse, that there could be different universe, and we can coexist. So I'll stop here. And the paradox theory or the paradox mentality, the discourse, doesn't help us to understand how did we do it. The interactions of our market actors, our political actors, our bureaucratic actors, our laborers. We did something. We're successful in some areas. We're not successful in some areas. But there's an indigenous process. Okay. Kind of, genesis or something, sui generis. So that's just possible. In that case, this kind of conceptual paradigm doesn't help us to think straight. Okay, and I hope Umar is listening to me, and he will try to address. And of course, the eminent discussant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mirza Bhai. Actually, today Mirza Bhai spoke for 45 minutes. 15 minutes here, 30 minutes with me during lunchtime. So altogether, I would say 45 minutes. Thank you, Mirza Bhai. We love these questions, and definitely, I think, in our book, actually tried to answer some of the questions that you mentioned. So next, I invite Dr. Kaji Maruful Islam. Please, Maruf Bhai. If you can stick to around 5 to 6 minutes, Mirza Bhai, I know it's very difficult to handle you. So much.
Thank you very much, distinguished guests, respected, very eminent scholars of the country. It's my great honor to be here, and distinguished participants, colleagues. Well, I mean, while I was listening to Mirza Bhai, of course, I feel the temptation to go beyond my chapter. In fact, the chapter was written almost more than 2 years back, and the research was conducted in 2018-19, and then we started writing the chapter. So by the time, like when we have this publication, it's already a little bit old. And over time, the situation has improved or developed or taken some very different dimensions. However, the chapter, what I worked with, Professor Selim Raihan and the other co-author, Rafika Ferdowsi, that is about political economy analysis of the role of judiciary and land disposition litigation in Bangladesh. So, as you can imagine, that the role of judiciary is also very important. Important in the sense that its relation to create compliance of contract, which is important for the growth and development, so to say. So, and in this chapter, what we try to understand primarily that what are the main causes of land disposition, and since the reasons for that was that many research already reported that land disposition is one of the major cause of poverty in Bangladesh. So we try to see that what are the main causes of land disposition. And the other reason was that since judiciary is one of the most important institutions, and we found that what Professor Selim Raihan has already said, that the judiciary was during that time was running with a huge case backlog. And I mean, I also checked the latest data that it is about 3.9 million case backlogs, which was reported in 2020. So it was a huge. So in one hand, we need a rule of law. And in order to perform the rule of law, we need judiciary to perform. But then while judiciary has a huge case backlog, about like 4 million case backlog, in that situation, how it really helps to to economy to grow, to development to run? So that was kind of a question we tried to understand in our chapter. And in doing that, we try to see, particularly, judiciary have many roles in different areas, but we focused in one area, which is about land disposition litigation. And since it was a political economy analysis, therefore we try to understand that what are the actors, major actors like state actors, non-state actors, and what are their interests and what are the relationship that exist within the judiciary and beyond judiciary, which has also great implication for the judiciary. So that was kind of broad goal of the chapter, and in doing that, in fact, the main argument of this chapter, which underscores the critical issue of land disposition in Bangladesh and the critical role that our judiciary play in addressing these kind of challenges. And what we saw that the huge systemic institutional inefficiencies within our judiciary. And there's this one, as we have already heard about it, this inefficiency, systemic inefficiency, which is in judiciary, that's not just because of the judiciary itself. I mean, many of the inefficiencies were created for the reasons which are actually beyond the judiciary itself. And there comes the relationship with the greater political system. There comes the relationship with other institutions which are in place, and what we saw, these inefficiencies, which actually deeply rooted in historical and socio-political context, economic factors, and also what we found with our cases. It was a qualitative study. We had several field. In Chittagong and in Gazipur, which land question is really important and very expensive. In that case, is what we saw that a kind of course, a configuration of interest among a set of players were constructed, and they are perpetuated, and they are being reproduced over time. And I mean, no matter how strong the reform agendas are being pushed from the top, but this intermediate and grassroots level interest configuration, they're actually resisting, and they're perpetuating the existing rent flow. So therefore, the big reform agendas were not actually being successful. I mean, there are several efforts from the government to bring reforms at the judiciary, but that didn't really been successful. So this interest, the very localized and within judiciary, and another set of interests and a network of actors that are outside the judiciary, and they have a kind of a understanding and interrelationship between these two set of actors and networks, and that actually helps this situation to grow. So in brief, what we found that of course it is definitely it requires a strong political will to bring the reform, and also it requires a lot of sort of technology supported reforms. For example, digitization can help to a large extent. We found some cases that they produced a better result, like in managing, and of course other issues. For example, we have shortage of judges. We have only like 10.6 judges per million people, which is very low in the region and also by the global standard. And of course, we also have issues with the capacity of the lawyers, with the capacity of the judges, capacity of the serestadar, peshkar, and all the clerks involved in the judiciary. And of course, the legal literacy is also very low among the common citizens. However, with this said, we try to come to that kind of conclusion that this chapter basically brought demanded some kind of attention and action, and of course, we concluded this chapter with this that the very question of the book, like whether this paradox is sustainable. So in order to make, I mean, forget about this paradox or whatever. So if this Bangladesh growth model can survive, if it is to survive, then of course this inefficient judiciary cannot, I mean, is not in a position to support it in the long run. That's one of our conclusions. So with that, thank you very much for your patient hearing, and we invite you to read the chapter, and we will also invite all sorts of conversation, engagement on this chapter. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kazi Maruful Islam. Now I invite Dr. Sana Bidisha.
Thank you. First of all, I'm very humbled and thankful to be here, and my sincere thanks to Salim and to the organizers and editors for allowing me to write this paper and to write something from my behalf. Now, before going into the chapter, which is about the private banking, one small point that I would like to mention, because the book is about the institutional diagnostic. The fact remains that I think although when we talk about the institutional issues, we are mostly concerned or talk about the macro perspective. But what I want to highlight is, like, I think when we look at the chapter, if we go through the chapter of the books, it is related to all of the people out there. So it is related to the common people, and it has very serious and very strong implication to the micro aspect. Because I work with micro issues, that's why I think that it is very closely connected to each of us. And from that point of view, I would say there are two basic broad things that I want to bring out. One is the fiscal space, because when we are talking about banking sector inefficiency, when we are talking about the taxation inefficiency, when we are talking about all of the backlog in the judiciary sector, then we are actually talking about the inefficiency in the resources that we have, or spending the resources in an effective manner. And that is actually what Dr. Selim Raihan initially pointed out, that is actually constraining us to have money for the social safety net, education, health, the things that the poor people need mostly at this point. Second point is like the inequality. And when we are talking about and what we have written and what we have seen in this book, that is very closely related to the inequality issue. We all know about the estimated figures that the BBS has pointed out about the inequality, but we all also know that that is actually very much underreported. And when we look at the inequality figure, when we are talking about for example, there are short-term and the long-term inequality that I think we should keep it in mind. When we are talking about the short-term inequality, we are actually talking about the inefficiency of the banking sector, that is related, poor performance of the taxation sector, that is related, that is very directly related to the inequality issue. But at the same time, when we are looking at some sectors like the primary education sector, because here there is no one of the authors of the books of the primary education. So Bozul Haq sir was, I think, contributed. So that is also having very crucial implication about the primary education and the human capital development of the country. And that has long-term implication on the persistent inequality and have a serious implication for the poverty reduction effort. And that is, I think, that's why from these 2 points, at least, I think this book is very important, especially at this point. And when I contributed in the book, I was fortunate to contribute in the book, in the chapter which is of private sector banking. And we all know that this is a very highly debated and widely discussed issue. And the paradox here is that over time, we have been able to expand the access, the financial inclusion, and our performance is quite surprisingly very good. But at the same time, when we look at the banking sector health, when we look at the non-performing loan, the paradox is there. So the paradox is there, despite of having such a huge non-performing loan, we have been able to expand the banking sector and included financially lot of people in the at the grassroots. So that paradox is something that we actually talked about at the beginning of the chapter. And what recommendation or what crucial things that we came up, one was the lack of autonomy of the central bank, and also the inclusion and the attachment of the Ministry of Finance and Finance Division in terms of the banking sector regulations and all of the issues. So the first recommendation or very important regulation is autonomy of the central bank and a very strong independent central bank. That was a very strong recommendation that we had. I think if we could have that, that would in fact resolve a lot of related issues as well. The second point that we actually talked, and what was something I would say disappointed us, is the problem we used to talk about when we were talking about the banking sector was the private was the public commercial bank, but now state-owned commercial bank. But now we talked about the private sector's bank, and in this chapter we talked about actually the private sector bank. So the point is the same corruption, same irregularities that we have seen in the state-owned commercial bank, that has over time transferred to the private sector bank. And that is something related to all of the insider lending, the very strong impact of the directors. And all of these issues actually pointed out to the fact that there is the very weak corporate governance in the PCBs. And in that case, one important issue is whenever we need to finance any fresh loan, it is extremely crucial that proper monitoring, proper analysis is done, and it's done on the basis of who is taking the loan. Of course, there are also issues like if I'm not taking the loan, maybe my wife is taking the loan. So there are issues like this, but at least that is one thing that I think we think which is very important. So when we are talking about fresh loan above a threshold, extreme measures should be taken, and it should be given without any sort of political or financial, any sort of issue should not be related to that. The third point is related to the fact is that when we are talking about all of these issues, of course, there is one thing that nowadays what we are talking about the margin of the bank. So now when we are margin of the bank, actually, when we wrote the report, there was not that much of that case. I think there was only the case of the Podda bank was there. But the fact remains that margin is actually, this type of margin is actually safeguarding the interest or safeguarding or cushioning the problem and that lingering the problem of the banking sector that we are having. So that is also another very important thing. While it is important to protect the interest of the depositor, at the same time, if with the same tool whether we are actually encouraging or not discouraging those who are actually behind the picture. So that is also very important thing we talked about in the chapter, and that was one of the recommendations which came there. And from that point of view, my final point is the Banking Sector Acts or BCA that we have. There has been some changes, which is I think, and people are talking about the changes, which is very important. But most important thing is the implementation. So whether proper political commitment, will is there to have the implementation of this amended BCA rule. And it is extremely also important that when we are talking about the reforms, because Dr. Selim Raihan already talked about the anti-reform sort of psychology or philosophy or coalition that we have. It's extremely crucial that we see that whether the reform is coming from inside, because we have seen that when the reform is coming from outside, often we welcome it, but we often don't welcome the reform when it's coming from inside. So I think it is also important that reform, on one hand, it is important it's coming from inside, but at the same time, reform, in whichever manner is possible, there is the political commitment and there is the interest to have the reform. So pro-reform centric idea there. But my just final point is, whenever we are talking about any reform, be it the banking sector reform or the judiciary sector reform, there are short-term costs. And we need to see how we can actually accommodate or safeguard those people who might be hard hit because of those reforms. And that is, I think, fundamental question and fundamental issue that we need to focus, that with the reform, there came some pain for those people who are at the grassroots level. And we must also have the safeguard mechanism to protect the interest of those people. I will thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vidisha. Now I invite, now we have heard from the authors, editors, co-authors. We now invite Dr. Jayadi Sattar to say a few words.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much. I guess I have to call you the moderator rather than the chair, because you're sitting next to so very distinguished and very respected people. Professor Rahman Saban, our octogenarian, iconic economist, as I said, and I happen to be his direct student. And he very kindly invited us to have a chat with him yesterday, so many of his other students. Dr. Bashir Rahman, economic advisor to the Honorable Prime Minister. And of course, my very distinguished colleague, younger colleague, Dr. Siddiqur Rahman Usmani, and very distinguished participants that I can see. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'd like to follow the protocol of three. I will just make 3 points related to this book, which authored by very distinguished people, and François Bourguignon is one of my also respected person. I used to work for him when he was chief economist at the World Bank. So my 3 points would deal with, first of all, this paradox issue, and followed by 2 other issues like the ready-made garments and the challenge of export diversification, which Salim, you have dealt with in your chapter. And I'm sorry, I wanted to read much of the book, but I ended up reading yours, and that also when I received the book some time ago, so I have to recollect. So on the issue of paradox, I would like to share some of my personal opinion, sort of a view. And I would like to go back into history a bit. When Bangladesh became independent, I was just a young, fresh graduate out of school, out of the university, faculty, into the civil service of Pakistan, then Bangladesh. And within 2-3 years in the service of government, as a young professional, as a young civil servant, I was forming some expectations about this country. And that in the next, let's say, 3, 4, 5 years, those expectations were taking shape. And what were the expectations? Not as pessimistic as Henry Kissinger would like to believe, but even then with a lot of limitations as to what Bangladesh could do with its
huge population, and at that time, no resources to talk about. So what could this country do? And so the expectations were limited. So fast forward 50 years, I've lived through the 50 years of Bangladesh, and we see, analysts, international analysts, development experts like Professor Stephen Durkon of Oxford University, saying, after reviewing, studying development experiences of many developing countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, concluding that Bangladesh was indeed a success case of development. And I can cite many more analysts. So now from the expectations to this, the point that we are in, let's say in the last 10 years or so, this was not in the expectations. And therefore that could be the surprise element. I'm not sure I would call it a paradox, but a surprise certainly, meaning that expectations were not there for Bangladesh to become a lower middle income country, becoming number 2 in the export of ready-made garments in the world marketplace, and many more. So that is my view of, I wouldn't call it paradox, and you already mentioned that ultimately your conclusion was not, this was not a paradox. It is the people of Bangladesh, actually, the workers, the hardworking workers of Bangladesh, the entrepreneurs, the young generation entrepreneurs, made what Bangladesh is today. Of course, with a lot of support coming from governments of Bangladesh, despite the fact, yes, that is a caveat that needs to be had, despite the fact that institutions were not as perfect as you people think. So Bangladesh went on this development journey handicapped. Initially, we thought population was a handicap, but now I think population is a resource. It's our hardworking labor force that is generating foreign exchange earnings through ready-made garment exports. It's also a hard-working workforce that is going abroad and bringing in huge amounts of foreign exchange. And these are the 2 pillars, in fact, of our economy right now: ready-made garment exports and remittances, which the government, I heard a senior secretary of the government say probably last week, that they would like to describe remittances as exports. And this is something that I have been writing about, that remittances is nothing but exports of factor services. So we have exports of goods, we have export of services, non-factor services, and we have export of factor services. So pretty soon we might see, services exports of non-factor and factor. So that's where we are. On the other issue of ready-made garments, I have a different point of view. I think, you in your chapter you did refer to the famous, or the infamous, I would say, IMF report by a young economist called Mashila, who was visiting Bangladesh and, in fact, talked to me also when he was writing this paper about the prospects of ready-made garment exports once the multi-fiber arrangement is phased out in 2005. And his conclusion was Bangladesh would be in trouble because, why he used a general equilibrium model. That's what the young generation economists do. They have lots of technical models to use. And then he used a parameter in his model, which was these quota premiums. And he said Bangladesh ready-made garment exports were doing well because of the quota premium. That was the driving factor. And of course, as the record shows, after the MFA phase out, actually Bangladesh ready-made garment exports were doing better. So he missed the main point. Why was ready-made garment exports doing so well in Bangladesh was because Bangladesh had the right resources. The ready-made garment production was a labor-intensive process, and Bangladesh had ample supply of labor. Pure economic principle. We have a labor-intensive product, and we would have comparative advantage in this labor-intensive product. And that's why Bangladesh did well. But I will have to also record something very radical that happened in order to open the door for ready-made garment exports. One was, of course, the multi-fiber arrangement of 1974. But more important for Bangladesh was the decision to allow duty-free import of inputs into the ready-made garment industry. And that was a big leap of faith for the policymakers. If they did not make that leap forward, any exports needs duty-free imports in order to get what we call world-priced inputs. And ready-made garment sector, 90% at that time, 90% of inputs had to be imported. So if you had to pay duties, and at that time, duties on yarn and fabric and all that was very high, over 100% actually. Bangladesh would never have even got one step forward in the ready-made garment industry. So that decision, again, I have to cite the name of Mr. Nur Qadir Khan, who was a very influential civil servant who became an entrepreneur. And he had his contacts in the Bangladesh Bank, at the Ministry of Finance, in the NBR, and he could convince them to give duty-free access to an industry that was not known at that time. So you're not getting that. We have been talking about giving that facility. It's not a privilege for an export. An export, in order to be competitive on the basis of its comparative advantage, requires world-priced inputs in order to have a level playing field for export success. So that is what the ready-made garments industry got, and we have succeeded. So that's point number 2. So let me come to point number 3, which is again something that Selim has addressed in his chapter, and I'm grateful that he did acknowledge, some of my writings and views on that subject. Now, since that time, I have also come to another conclusion. I did point out that the current tariff structure and the protection structure is undermining export performance. But over the last couple of years, I've done more research into this, going down to product by product levels and checking, where our positions, where we stand in terms of exports of non-garment export. When it comes to garment exports, in terms of competitiveness, we have using standard methodologies of competitiveness. We found in ready-made garments, Bangladesh is highly competitive, even with China, Vietnam, anybody. But we are also exporting about 1,500 non-garment products at the HS 6-digit level. 1,500 products almost year after year. In some years, we have an extra, 400 products. In some years, we have 300-400 products that disappear. But when it comes to competitiveness, if we are competitive in ready-made garments, which is a labor-intensive industry, how come we are not competitive in footwear? How come we are not competitive in electronics or toys? And the fact, the study shows that I can list 500 of our currently exported products in which we have pretty strong comparative advantage when compared with other exporters of similar products to those different markets. So why is it that those products are not growing? And why is the export basket not diversifying in spite of policymakers and everybody saying that we need to diversify? Everybody knows that. we are not diversifying, or there is no traction in diversification, simply because the current protection structure, the tariff protection structure, is undermining, is creating an anti-export bias that affects non-garment exports, not garments. The garments, the garment sector is given this free trade channel, the duty-free import. That I have argued time and again that give this facility to all the non-garment exporters. But that is not happening because that leap of faith taken in the early 1980s is not there now. NBR, which is controlling the tariff regime, is still not convinced that we need to do that. But in my latest research work, I've argued that this tariff structure, protection structure, creates an anti-export bias, strong anti-export bias for the non-ready-made garment exports, and this has become the binding constraint to export diversification. So as long as we continue with the current tariff regime, as long as we do not rationalize the tariff structure, there will be no traction in export diversification, period. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Jadi Sastry. Now I invite Professor M.M. Akash. Please, sir.
আমি বাংলাতেই বলি। মঞ্চে উপবিষ্ট আমার শ্রদ্ধেয় বয়োজ্যেষ্ঠ অর্থনীতিবিদগণ, আমার শিক্ষক এবং অন্যান্য সবাইকে ধন্যবাদ জানিয়ে এবং আমাকে এখানে বলার সুযোগ দেওয়ার জন্য ধন্যবাদ জানিয়ে শুরু করছি। মানে যেই বইটা নিয়ে আজকে আলোচনা হচ্ছে, এই বইটার মূল কথা আমি যেভাবে বুঝেছি সেটা হচ্ছে এই যে বাংলাদেশে একটা গ্রোথ হয়েছে এবং হিউম্যান ডেভেলপমেন্ট ইন্ডেক্সে কতগুলো সাউথ এশিয়ান অন্যান্য কান্ট্রিগুলোর তুলনায় বেটার পারফরমেন্স দেখা গেছে। এটাতে অনেকে ভেবেছিল যে এরকম হবে না, কিন্তু যেহেতু এটা হয়েছে সেই জন্য অনেকে এটাকে সারপ্রাইজ বলেছে। কিন্তু ওই একই সময় দেখা গেছে যে ইনস্টিটিউশনাল ইন্ডিকেটর, যেগুলো দিয়ে আমরা সাধারণত একটা গ্রোথ ফ্রেন্ডলি বা ডেভেলপমেন্ট ফ্রেন্ডলি ইন্ডিকেটর বলি ইনস্টিটিউশনের, যেগুলো সেই ইন্ডিকেটর গুলো দিয়ে ডেভেলপমেন্টটা বাংলাদেশের তেমন একটা হয়নি। বটম 20 কান্ট্রিজের মধ্যে এশিয়া আছে, তাই কি? আচ্ছা, তাহলে প্রশ্নটা দাঁড়িয়েছে যে ইনস্টিটিউশনাল ডেভেলপমেন্ট হলো না কিন্তু গ্রোথ হলো, এটাকে আমরা প্যারাডক্স বলবো কিনা? দিস ইজ দ্য ফার্স্ট কোশ্চেন। আচ্ছা, যদি এটাকে আমরা প্যারাডক্স বলি, তাহলে সেকেন্ড কোশ্চেন হলো যে এটা সাস্টেইন করবে কিনা। সেখানে এটার এই বইয়ের আনসার হলো যে এটা সাস্টেইন করবে না। মানে সে অ্যাপ্রিহেনশন প্রকাশ করছে যে এটা সাস্টেইন করবে না। তাহলে আগে কেন করছিল, এখন কেন করবে না? দ্যাট ইজ দ্য ক্রিটিক্যাল ডায়াগনোসিস। আচ্ছা, সেই ডায়াগনোসিসটা করতে গিয়ে মাইক্রো অ্যানালাইসিস হয়েছে, সেক্টরাল অ্যানালাইসিস হয়েছে, এবং কতগুলো সেক্টরকে আইডেন্টিফাই করা হয়েছে যে এইখানে আর আগাবে না, বা এইখানে এমন ইনস্টিটিউশনাল প্রবলেম তৈরি হয়েছে যে এখানে ওটাকে চেঞ্জ না করে গ্রোথ ড্রাইভিং ফোর্স গুলো আগাতে পারবে না। এরকম কয়েকটা সেক্টরের উদাহরণ আছে, যেমন একটা হলো ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল সেক্টর। বলা হয়েছে যে এখানে এমন একটা পর্যায়ে এটা চলে গেছে যে এখন এই ইনস্টিটিউশনটাকে ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল সেক্টরের গুড গভর্নেন্সের উপযুক্ত করতে না পারলে ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল ক্যাওস হয়ে যাবে, এবং ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল ক্যাওস হলে ডেভেলপমেন্ট নষ্ট হয়ে যাবে। এইটা মোটামুটি মনে হয় বিশ্বাসযোগ্য, এটা এখন যে মার্জিং টার্জিং করে নানা রকম কায়দা কানুন করছে, তাতে যে খুব একটা ফল পাওয়া যাবে না সেটা বিদিশা বলেছে। সুতরাং এইটা একটা সত্যি এই জায়গাটায় মনোযোগ দেওয়ার দরকার আছে এবং এই ডায়াগনোসিসটা ঠিক মতো করার দরকার আছে। হয়তো কিছুটা ডায়াগনোসিস হয়েও গেছে, পলিসিও বার হয়ে গেছে যে আচ্ছা আমরা যদি সেন্ট্রাল ব্যাংকে পরিপূর্ণ ফ্রিডম দিয়ে দিই, তাহলে অটোনমি দিয়ে দিই, পলিটিক্যাল হস্তক্ষেপ না করি, তাহলে হয়তো হবে। আমি এই সিম্পল সাজেশনের সঙ্গে একমত না, তাহলেও হবে না। কারণ এটা কিছুটা আমার এই জন্য মনে হয়, হোসেন জিল্লুর রহমান একবার একটা পয়েন্ট বলেছিল এইসব ইনস্টিটিউশনাল পলিসি এইসব আলোচনা করতে গিয়ে, যে আমাদের দেশের প্রবলেমটা কি আইন কানুন, পলিসি, অর্গানাইজেশন, এগুলোর প্রেজেন্স অর অ্যাবসেন্স, নাকি আমাদের দেশে প্রবলেম হলো সেগুলোর ইমপ্লিমেন্টেশন, এবং ইমপ্লিমেন্টেশনের ক্ষেত্রে প্রবলেম হলো the negative forces are more powerful than positive forces. আমার বরঞ্চ এই ডায়াগনোসিসটাই কারেক্ট মনে হয়, যে আমাদের মানুষ নিয়ে চিন্তা করতে হবে যে কারা ডিসিশন মেকার, কারা ইমপ্লিমেন্টার, ইমপ্লিমেন্ট হলে কাদের ইন্টারেস্ট সার্ভড হয়, যাদের ইন্টারেস্ট সার্ভড হয় তারা কতটুকু পাওয়ারফুল, আর যারা ইমপ্লিমেন্ট না হলে যাদের ইন্টারেস্ট সার্ভড হয় তারা কতটুকু পাওয়ারফুল। এবং সেই পলিটিক্যাল ব্যালেন্স অফ ফোর্সটা পলিটিক্যাল ফ্রন্টে, ইনস্টিটিউশনাল ফ্রন্টে ঠিক না করা পর্যন্ত এখানে কোনো, যেটা কিছুটা আমার মনে হয় মির্জার অ্যানালাইসিসে কিছুটা এসেছে, সেই অ্যানালাইসিসটা যদি আমরা করতে যাই তাহলে আমার প্রথম যেটা বলবো যে আওয়ামী লীগ গভর্নমেন্ট মানে নিশ্চয়ই এখানে ইকোনমিক ডেভেলপমেন্টে স্টেট ইজ এ বিগ প্লেয়ার। তাহলে স্টেটের পাওয়ারটা কিভাবে ইউজড হচ্ছে, দ্যাট ইজ এ বিগ ফ্যাক্টর। এবং স্টেটের পাওয়ারটা কোন ক্লাসের পক্ষে ব্যবহার হচ্ছে এবং কোন ক্লাসের পক্ষে ব্যবহার হচ্ছে না, দ্যাট ইজ দ্য রিয়েল কোশ্চেন। দ্যাট ইজ দ্য রিয়েল কোশ্চেন। স্টেটের অ্যানাউন্সড পলিসি পজিশন ইজ নট দ্য কোশ্চেন। স্টেটের নলেজ অ্যাবাউট দ্য রিয়েলিটি ইজ নট দ্য কোশ্চেন। স্টেট যারা রান করছে, ফাইনালি ডিসিশন নিচ্ছে, তাদের রিয়েল ইন্টারেস্ট কি, দ্যাট ইজ দ্য আসল কোশ্চেন। সেইটা বার করতে গেলে একটা খুব ইজি আনসার আছে, যেটা আবুল বরকতের দেওয়া আনসার। সেটা হলো there is a currently a ruling power structure, a nexus, a network of dishonest businessmen, dishonest politicians, and businessmen, politicians are dishonest bureaucrats. যদি ওই নেক্সাসটা বেশি পাওয়ারফুল থাকে, তাহলে অপোজিট প্রত্যেকটার ক্ষেত্রে যদি কিছু অনেস্ট বিজনেসম্যান থাকে, অনেস্ট পলিটিশিয়ান থাকে এবং অনেস্ট আরেকটা কি বললাম ব্যুরোক্রেট থাকে, তাহলে তো আলটিমেটলি এই দুটো ফোর্সকে আমরা পাশাপাশি দাঁড় করিয়ে তাদের গেইমে কে আলটিমেটলি ফাইনাল ডিসিশনটা নিচ্ছে সেটার উপরেই আউটকামটা ডিপেন্ড করবে। ইট ইজ নট এ কোশ্চেন অফ রিডিজাইনিং ইনস্টিটিউশন, রিডিজাইনিং অর্গানাইজেশন, redesigning rules, regulations. It is a question of who is enjoying the real power. সেইটা অ্যানালাইসিস করতে গেলে পরে পলিটিক্যাল অ্যানালাইসিস এবং কারা জিতছে কারা, এটা গেলো একটা সাইড। আর দুটো ফ্যাক্টর আমি খালি বলবো। একটা বড় ফ্যাক্টর হলো জিও পলিটিক্স, কারণ খালি ইন্টারনাল ব্যালেন্স অফ ফোর্স দিয়ে এটা ডিসাইডেড হবে না, এক্সটার্নাল ফোর্স কাকে এনকারেজ করছে সেটাও একটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট কোশ্চেন। সেখানে এখন যেই ব্যালেন্সটা আমরা দেখি যে ইন্ডিয়া, চায়না, রাশিয়া এবং পার্টলি মিডল ইস্টের কিছু ফোর্স, তারা বাংলাদেশ গভর্নমেন্টের, প্রেজেন্ট গভর্নমেন্টের কাছে কিছুটা পজিটিভ অ্যাটিটিউড দেখাচ্ছে। ওয়েস্টার্নরা অতটা পজিটিভ অ্যাটিটিউড দেখাচ্ছে না, তারা গুড গভর্নেন্সের ইন্ডিকেটর অন্যান্য অনেক কথা বলছে, আর এরা বলছে যে ভাই চালায় যাও, মেগা প্রজেক্ট, টাকা পয়সা আমরা দেব। তো এইটা একটা ইম্পর্টেন্ট ফ্যাক্টর যেটা ফিউচার আউটকামটা ডিটারমিন করবে। আর আরেকটা যেটা এটা ছাড়া আরেকটা যেটা, সেটা হলো সাইলেন্ট মেজরিটি পিপল, যারা চায় যে ইনস্টিটিউশন গুলো মেরিটোক্রেসির বেসিসে হোক, যারা চায় যে পাওয়ার ডিসেন্ট্রালাইজড হয়ে উপজেলা নির্বাচনটা ঠিক মতো হোক, যারা চায় যে একটা অ্যাকাউন্টেবিলিটি থাকুক, ট্রান্সপারেন্সি থাকুক, যারা চায় যে ঋণ খেলাপি হলমার্ক বলেন অন্যান্য আমি আর নাম বললাম না, পর পর যে কেলেঙ্কারিগুলোর কারা করেছে সবাই জানে, কোথায় আছে তাও জানে, কি করেছে টাকা দিয়ে তাও জানে, কিন্তু কিছুই করা যায় না, সেটা কিভাবে করা যায় সেটা যারা চায়, কিন্তু তাদের তো পাওয়ার নাই, তারা তো একটা অর্গানাইজড ফোর্স নয়, বিশেষ করে যখন ডেমোক্রেসি বা ভোট যখন পাওয়ারে থাকা ডিটারমিন করে না। মানি যখন মানি অ্যান্ড মাসল যখন মানি মাসল এবং ম্যানিপুলেশন যখন ডিটারমিন করে পাওয়ারে থাকা, অবশ্য পাওয়ারে না থাকলেই বাকি নতুন যে অল্টারনেটিভটা আসবে, আমরা তো খুব সুন্দর শিখেছি যে রেজিম, ইকোনমিক রেজিম ঠিক থাকলে পলিটিক্যাল রেজিম চেঞ্জ হলেই বাকি। সুতরাং মানে অ্যাকচুয়ালি এখানে ইনস্টিটিউশন নিয়ে ডায়াগনোসিস করা যাবে অনেক কিছু, কিন্তু ইনস্টিটিউশন কেমনে চেঞ্জ হবে সেটা বোধহয় এখনো আনসার আমরা জানি না। থ্যাঙ্কস।
Thank you very much, Professor Akash. We have actually kind of exhausted our that 1 hour session, but still I think we have to we can actually invite a couple of more participants to share their views. I now request Dr. Manzoor Hassan from PIDS, if you could briefly just share your views, and then I'm just checking Professor Farida Khan. I can see you, ma'am. You are in the Zoom. If you'd also like to say a few words, please. After Dr. Manzoor Hassan, you can say a few words.
Okay, thank you, Salim. Distinguished, respected panelist in the podium. In fact, I have come here to listen and learn, not to talk about this book, because it is unfair to talk about the book, because I didn't have the chance to read the whole book carefully. But what I have learned over the discussions from the last few hours, I think I can share some of my views on the basis of what I have listened from here. First of all, the title of the book says, "Is the paradox sustainable?" So it definitely brings some question to us. There should have a time frame about how long it will continue or how long it will sustain. I think if we assume that the paradox is here and paradox is still continuing, the development paradox, then there should have a certain time frame after that the paradox will be eliminated or it will not continue. I think this issue could be, if we look at the East Asian development model, then it could be related to the middle income trap model, I think. So if Bangladesh could achieve a certain middle income status, I think after that it will not sustain, because of if we cannot develop the institutions and governance to a certain level, what we are seeing at the East Asian countries, they are now, most of the countries are now in the middle income trap. So it is one of the argument, it could be one of the argument how long the paradox will continue. So the reason is that can we continue with the current level of 8 to 10% tax GDP ratio? Can we continue 13 or 14% of our budget of the GDP to continue our development level to reach to a certain level of development? So these are the issues that have been discussed in Salim's chapters and others, what I have learned from here. So this is an issue, I think, political regime, they will change themselves, I think, after certain time frame, maybe after certain level of development, infrastructure development, other things. I think if we consider neoclassical economics theories and others, it is definitely they have to change their mindset and development, I think, institutions and governance. So this, I just want to mention this, and paradox, I still believe that that was a paradox. If we don't tell about the density dividend, either it could be positive or negative. If we don't relate to our natural resources, if we don't think about the governance issues, institutions, still we are continuing with a certain level of diversification, export diversification, certain level of taxes revenues. Every year it is increasing to a certain level. Maybe financial institutions have been doing well after 1990s when financial liberalizations took place. Trade liberalization took place in the 1980s and 1990s. Then we are now exporting maybe a certain level of amount that is, I think, commendable to some extent. So this type of things will be happening over the time, but this paradox will not continue maybe once Bangladesh reaches to the middle income status. That is my conclusion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Majid Hussain. I'm checking with Professor Farida Khan. Professor Khan, would you like to say a few words? Okay, I think it's not. So I invite Mr. Abir Hussain. Yes. Briefly, Abir.
Very briefly. I think let's be solution oriented, because this is a fascinating book and fascinating conversation, even better than the ones that we have in Oxford. So congratulations, sir, on that. So I think few solutions. If we look at successful cases like South Korea, Park Chung-hee, like slightly less successful Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, or Lee Kuan Yew, none of them were big fans of rule of law or good governance. They were very much export focused. I think if there is one suggestion that I want to give our Prime Minister, that would be export focused. As long as you are export focused, that takes care of a lot of the problems, a lot of the misallocation and everything. And I think development itself is a very messy process. So we can't expect to have institutions like Denmark and then start growing. The research by Yoon Ang and Stefan Darkon, who's my supervisor, has shown that, capabilities that the private sector and public sector co-evolve. Once you create a large enough private sector, it creates pressure to develop institutions. For example, imagine us 20 years back. We would survive without electricity. Today, if you don't give electricity, all of us will be in the road in this heat. So I think that's important. So just two suggestions. One is, I think what we should prioritize is entering new global value chains. And if we are part of existing global value chains like garments, the focus should be on upgrading. So we should constantly ask ourselves, what is the next set of value addition that we can send? And this is where, when Sir mentioned that if you have anti-export bias, other than in other sectors, there is non-garments. So there is an interesting World Bank work that if you have anti-export bias, no matter how much you invest in infrastructure, that does not help with export. So I think for export upgrading, what we have done in garments, we have to replicate the similar thing in electronics and other value chains. I give examples of Philippines. A long time a failure case in East Asia. In the last 2 decades, it has upgraded to aerospace value chains thanks to Japanese investment, automotive value chains. I'll give you the example of even Vietnam. Samsung investment brought so many other MNCs into Vietnam. So there are success cases there, but I guess what is important is we should not bound ourselves with wholesale bureaucratic reforms. In Bangladesh's political economic context, it's unrealistic. I think we rather create pockets of effectiveness that many other countries have done. And then those pockets of effectiveness would create a middle class that will create pressure, and institutions over time will improve. So just my brief.
Very, very, very many thanks, Abir. We have actually very few minutes left, so we have extended actually the time. So we can have 2 or 3 questions. I would say more comments rather than questions, if anyone is interested in making any comment. Yeah, excellent. So I think since we have exhausted our time and we can't extend much of the time. So I now request Professor Siddiqur Rahman Usmani to share his views, please. Sir, yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I would like to compliment the team, not just the Bangladesh team, but the team of the entire project, the EDI project, which is an extremely exciting project as far as I can see, and potentially extremely valuable. And it's a pioneering project for the reasons that you have explained and the book has explained. It is actually trying to cover uncharted territories in many ways. The fundamental issues that are being discussed are nothing new, but the framework and the methodology under which they are being investigated is novel. And that novelty will necessarily invite comments, criticisms, debate. And Umar Salam actually invited debate in his presentation. And it is in the spirit of debate that I want to make some observations. My observations are primarily on the overall methodology of the project, not just of the book, but I do want to say something about the paradox, if time permits and if Selim permits, toward the end. Now, what I'm going to say may sound critical, but I do mean them in a constructive spirit. I don't know who invented the three-point protocol that you mentioned, but whoever invented it, I independently arrived upon 3 points I wanted to make on the overall methodology. The first point is, when I didn't read the whole book, but I read some of the relevant chapters, relevant for me, that is. And what struck me is in the methodology part, not just the book, but the overall project, that what this project is trying to do is trying to identify dysfunctional institutions. That's the primary focus of the exercise. And is doing a cross-country kind of exercise to find out what is dysfunctional where, under what circumstances. Good idea. What about the functional ones? What about the institutions that do work? Why aren't we looking for them? That I found very puzzling, even more puzzling than the Bangladesh paradox. Why do we look only for the negative ones? Important to know them, but why don't you look for the positive, well-functioning institutions? If we want to learn from cross-country experience, we want to learn something from Benin, from Mozambique, Tanzania, why wouldn't we learn what's working for them and then ask, will they work for us? If not, why not? If so, why? That's the way I think we should proceed. So the very fundamental approach I found is, and it's also very strange, because earlier, several decades ago, when we wanted to learn from East Asia, I think we're all trying to focus on the positives. What did they did which helped them? And today we are asking what is it, what they did, what we're doing, what's not helping us, dysfunctional. I think we need to bring together both the positive and negative, well-functioning and non-functional institutions. Together we'll be able to learn better. That's the first point I wanted to make. The second point, which is very closely related to something that Akash was discussing, I agreed fully with him, that in a lot of the cases, particularly when we talk about the regulatory institutions, what I want to call the public sector institutions, why they don't work, in most cases, the problem is in the implementation. And I agree with Akash on that. And I don't think many of the authors disagree with either, because, for example, when they're discussing why many of these institutions don't work, I can see a list of items that the book mentioned. I just read it out for you. It could be lack of competent civil servants. Secondly, their tendency to shirk or get involved in corrupt deals. Third, excessively intricate nature of rules and administrative laws and administrative rules, undue multiplicity and mutual inconsistency of the rules, or simply bad organization of the administration. Now, this is a plausible list of possible reasons, but they look rather ad hoc to me. Each of them you can think of as possible, but how do you integrate all of them into a conceptual framework which says, yes, this is where the problem lies in implementation? The book and the project expressly tries to adopt an inductive approach, as it says. But in my view, adopting an inductive approach doesn't preclude having some kind of conceptual apparatus in your mind. In fact, whenever you're doing an inductive work, whether you admit or not, whether you realize or not, there has to be somewhere an implicit conceptual framework in your mind. Otherwise, you don't even know what to look for. So if it's the case, then I think it is better to start with an explicit conceptual framework, do the inductive work, and then revise the framework if need be. But you have to start from somewhere. One place where I would like they could have started, I want to point, most people often don't notice it. Actually, one framework was suggested more than 200 years ago. You'd be surprised who did it. Jeremy Bentham, the most utilitarian of all philosophers. He is known as a utilitarian philosopher, but what most people don't know, he was a very radical reformer. In fact, he was a leading leader, a group of philosophers who was called philosophical radicals. And he studied very seriously why government doesn't function properly. In his view, properly means they don't try to maximize the utility sum, which was his goal. But it doesn't matter what the goal is. The point he's trying to make was, if you try your administrators, your politicians, your bureaucrats to achieve whatever social goal you set for them, you cannot do so without thinking about precisely the problem that Akash said. Will they implement them? He said the starting point is no, because they will look after their interest. And therefore, the primary task is how to make them serve the common good while trying to serve his own good. Now, in modern economic literature, we call it the incentive compatibility problem within the framework of the principal agent theory. So in this framework, Bentham didn't use those phrase, the people are the principals. The bureaucrats and the politicians are the agents. The task is how to make those agents pursue the goal of the principals while pursuing their own interest. We call it incentive compatibility problem today. He gave a different name. He called it the interest junction principle. How do you combine the interest of the individuals with the interest of the owners? And he gave some very detailed instructions about how to go about them, which I'm not going to go into, but that's a kind of conceptual framework. But he did something more important, which also Akash actually mentioned another state. Suppose you have to give them all these details of how to organize these institutions, which hopefully will make the agents work in the interest of the principals. But how do you make them convinced that they are the agents, people are the principals, rather than the other way around? They can think of themselves as the principal and people are their servants. How do you make sure of that? How do you make them behave like agents rather than behave like principals? He said, the only way to do it is to make them accountable through a democratic process. So above all those nitty-gritty of institutional recommendations he was making an overarching institutional recommendation that those underlying institutions will work only when you have established the overarching democratic institutions, which effectively makes politicians and bureaucrats account to the people. Only then they will work as agents, not otherwise. Now, this idea that you have to fix the overarching institution first before you look at the details of the institutions is my third point. And this third point is simply the point that you have to recognize that when you think about institutions, you cannot think them in isolations. They interact with each other. And the interaction is often seen as in a horizontal manner. But the real interaction is vertical, hierarchical. You have to recognize there are hierarchy of institutions. Unless you fix the top, you cannot fix the bottom. And this idea has been promoted most illustriously, most eloquently by John Rawls in his theory of justice. His theory of justice starts with this presumption that if you want to establish justice in the society, you have to fix first what he called basic institutions of the society, of which constitutions, legislature, others are important. And then he goes to a four-stage process. Then you fix legislatives, then particular laws, and then particular policies. Now, of course, his context was justice. In this case, the context was development. But the principle, I believe, is the same. You have to recognize the hierarchy of principles and then go from the top and go down to the bottom. Unless you fix the top, the bottom cannot be fixed. That, I think, also was the message that Akash was giving. That completes my three-point protocol. Do I have time for Bangladesh?
Sir, a couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes will be two assertions without explaining. The two assertions are, contrary to the expectation of the book, I don't think the book has answered the question whether the paradox is sustainable or not. The second statement is, the reason they have not answered the question is they were not equipped to answer the question because of the methodological deficiency that I have mentioned. In particular, the problem that they have only tried to look for dysfunctional institutions, not the well-functioning ones. That exhausts my 2 minutes. Do you want me to elaborate or no? If not, all right.
Please.
Okay. Thank you. I knew I could tempt you. On the paradox, I won't take too long, sorry. On the paradox, first thing I want to say in response to what Hassan was saying, I don't think there's a problem in describing it as a paradox. It was a paradox, as a surprise, as Wahiduddin Mahmud called it, not in relation to some universal model of development or societal change. He was calling it a surprise in relation to a particular conception, relative to a particular conception about governance, which has been common for the last 30 years, is that without good governance, you cannot develop and develop inclusively. That's the benchmark. Against it, he noted that Bangladesh is a surprise because we have actually developed a number of areas without good governance. So it was a paradox in that sense, relative to that governance paradigm, not with the universal model of development. So it is all right and it's useful. And probably we have now, by this time, Wahiduddin Mahmud, others, he and others have explained. But the fact that paradox has been explained, if it has been explained, doesn't discredit it as a paradox. And a paradox explained is still a paradox. But now that you're able to explain it, that's fine. But unfortunately, in this particular case, I don't think it has been explained. If you have to explain it in an institutional framework, then logically what needs to do is, you have to first identify, this is something actually Akash also said, you have to identify what are the positive functional institutions that created the good outcomes and what are the negative or dysfunctional institutions that created the bad outcomes. And so far it seems that the good outcomes have outweighed the bad outcomes because somehow the good institutions which created the good outcomes have outweighed the weak ones. And then the sustainability question will arise. Will the institutions will created the good outcomes continue to remain good or valid in the future, or over time they will be outweighed by the negative ones? That's the question of sustainability. But before you do that, you have to explain the paradox itself in terms of opposing institutions. You could not do that in terms of opposing institutions because you did not look for positive institutions in the first place. The development surprise pointed out to two major areas. One of the some of the social indicators have made improvement, and health in particular, health outcomes of many people, women's empowerment, etc. And then, of course, growth as a whole, driven by RMG in particular. Now, in the case of health, you did not search for positive institutions because health was not even one of your sectors. So one positive area was completely washed out. The other positive area which you did concentrate, RMG, you tried to explain it in terms of deals framework. Now, what are deals? Now, in a sense, any industrial policy meant for a specific sector can be described as a deal between the government and the capitalist of that particular sector. You can always call industrial policy as a deal, but that's not the deals framework that you are referring to in your theoretical framework. Because in your book, in page 23, specifically says that deals framework works in the absence of institutions. So deals framework is an extra institutional explanation. So if you are explaining RMG growth within the deals framework, you are saying that good institutions did not help RMG. It is the deals that helped. I disagree. I'm not an RMG expert, but from my general understanding, I don't think RMG prospered without institutional support. Some of the institutional support that Zayed Bhai was mentioning, the incentives that were given, the subsidies that were given, the support they were given. You can call them deal in a general sense, but those deals were not extra institutional deals. They're institutions in the sense they're rule bound, they're not arbitrary. It's not that Mr. X was given duty-free access to input, Mr. Y wasn't. It was given for this sector as a whole. So it was a rule-based institutional framework that helped RMG to grow. The question now is whether that institutional framework will continue to deliver the goods in the future, not just for RMG, but for other sectors as well. But in order to answer that question, you must first agree to look for both well-functioning institutions and dysfunctional institutions instead of focusing only on the dysfunctional ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Osmani. I think it's a fascinating discussion on the volume, but that also kind of suggests that we need to have very detailed discussion on the chapters because I think some of the very important points are, we also have some answers, but I think because of the time constraint, we can't do it here. But I really look forward to have a larger engagement. And this is something what Umar was also mentioning, that we invite debates, we invite kind of critical comments, and that will be really very helpful for, further taking this discussion forward. So I'll come to Umar later, but because you can say a few words in response to some of the comments. Before that, let me invite Professor Raihan Sohan to share his views. Sir.
Is this okay? Can I be heard? Yes. Well, thank you again, Selim. I've read bits of the book. I'm very impressed. It's, I think, a very valuable contribution to the literature. And as have been mentioned by others, it deserves to be addressed and discussed much more intensively than is warranted at a book release program, which is more of a public relations exercise, and we all like to participate in that and to say good things about the book. Many good things deserve to be said, but other comments have been made. Osmani has given us the taste of that, where very serious discussion is merited. Before I proceed, and because I forget, I would like to express my appreciation at being able to see and hear from Umar Salam. I had the privilege of being a junior and much less distinguished colleague to his father, Professor Abdul Salam, when we were in Cambridge. And he was, as I said, a great person of pride and inspiration to all of us in my generation, and hopefully long after that. So I'm very glad to have met you. The question I would like to ask, and this would apply to Umar as much as to Selim, is your choice of countries in this analysis. From what I understand, in the broad study that you did, you chose Benin, Tanzania, Mozambique, and of course Bangladesh, and we've been studying that. Now, I know nothing about the other countries, but on a priori principles, I would say that these were not countries which would be getting any gold medals for their institutions. The logic of this remark would be that at least one country should have been introduced into your analytical framework, which actually had well-functioning institutions, so that we could actually identify what difference that actually makes. Countries which might have come to mind would certainly have been Vietnam. Of course, we don't know whether Vietnam actually has well-functioning institutions in the sense that has been measured by your analytical framework. Certainly in the analysis that you have done for Bangladesh of a comparative nature, Vietnam and China figure much better than we do. But I suspect that in the broader analytical framework, there would be quite a number of other countries which would be shown as having better functioning institutions than both Vietnam and China. Now, on the other hand, if the outcome of well-functioning institutions is then meant to be development performance, then obviously we don't just have a Bangladesh paradox, we also have a Vietnam and a China paradox, because compared to a whole range of countries, these are the development and growth leaders in the world economy. And why, with less efficient institutions, they manage to outperform other countries is something that merits discussion. And if you had, in fact, at least included Vietnam into your analytical framework, would have got a very rich explanatory outcome from the course of your study. I don't know whether at some point you may want to go down that road. The other point I wish to make is, of course, this whole concept of paradox and surprise. Now, as Usmani pointed out, this originates in this broader analytical framework of good governance producing positive development outcomes. Now, those of you who have been around long enough, that would include Monsieur Rehman and Usmani and I presume Umar as well, would be aware that the whole relationship between governance and development was not really a mainstream part of the development narrative until the beginning of the 1990s. In fact, dissenting elements who were challenging the structural adjustment agendas of the World Bank and the IMF in the 1980s were precisely pointing this out, that they do not address issues of governance, they do not address issues of the political economy, which drives the development process, they do not address issues of ownership over development reforms. And this explains why development outcomes do not necessarily follow from a particular reform paradigm, which was then being advocated by the World Bank and the IMF. And we used the East Asian model, particularly the models of South Korea, Taiwan, to try to point out that many features in the developmental transformation of these countries originated in a much more proactive state and a state delivering outcomes. And the question which we were attempting to answer when we were looking at problems of then governance is that was the performance of South Korea state and the Taiwanese state or the Singaporean state the result of the quality of their governance, or was it specific to a particular economic policy paradigm? I mean, the standard question we always posed was, why did Singapore Airlines, the state-owned enterprise, become one of the world's most efficient airlines compared to Bangladesh Biman, or for that matter, Air India? And was there a very significant divergence in the governance practices? And if so, what was the nature of that governance process which led to these outcomes? Similarly, the success of South Korea and Taiwan initially owed very heavily to industrial policy and a very proactive state, where the state was actually also directly intervening in the economy. The classical example which used to be cited in those days was the growth of the steel and machine building industry in South Korea, which went explicitly against the advice of the World Bank at that time, that these were all contrary to the comparative advantage principles, which they were then promoting in the world, and that this industrial policy would go nowhere. But it turned out that the Pohang steel mill set up in the state sector turned out to be the most efficient steel mill in the world and outcompeted and exported technology to US Steel, which was the leading steel manufacturer at that time. So that was the nature of the discourse when governance came on the table. Now, we found, in fact, when CPD took up this first study on governance in the beginning of the 1990s, I was traveling in the US and I went to the World Bank to see then what was the working literature on governance and found it was very underdeveloped at that time. The World Bank only began to get on board after the economic crisis in Asia in the middle of the 1990s. So this whole model which they then constructed about the relationship of governance and development was in fact not really part of either the literature or the reform discourse virtually up to the beginning of the 90s. Now everyone is talking governance. And I was observing that after the 90s, when we were visited by the vice president of the World Bank during the sort of annual consortium meeting, they were then giving these long lectures to us on the need for good governance and democracy and so on and so forth. But when we were raising these issues with them in the 80s, the general discourse was that this has nothing to do with development. So, as I said, all these, I mean, the history of economic thought is a reasonably good subject to study over here, and this is an issue over here. Now, why I'm bringing this up today is that at the moment, you also need to revisit the whole notion of the link between governance and development. I mean, obviously, there is a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that countries with very poor records of governance, which includes Bangladesh, can do reasonably well developmentally. So the problem, the paradox may not lie in the Bangladesh experience, but in the theory itself, which needs to be revisited as to whether there is a sufficiently robust causality relating these two factors in defining development. I mean, Usmani should certainly be applying his thoughts to this, that how come we are then sort of bothering about this problem in the first place? A whole bunch of countries may be doing quite well with poor governance and with institutional weaknesses of the sort which you have actually identified over here. This is, I think, another issue which needs to be addressed. If we, in fact, think of development as an autonomous process and see what are the dynamics, we can get back to the old discourse where we can then fit in governance and institutions as one more factor rather than the central leverage in driving that particular process. The second issue, I think, you need to address over here when you are then sort of looking at the development discourse, the paradox, is of course in your title itself. I mean, your title says, is the Bangladesh paradox sustainable? Now, whether you wanted to say, is the Bangladesh developmental success sustainable, may perhaps have been more central to the discussion in this volume. Whether the paradox is sustainable is, of course, almost a metaphysical question. And I think you may keep that particular issue in mind. In fact, the whole word paradox I find kind of surprising. But anyway, I point this out to you. I already suggested to you that there was a title deficiency over here, which needed to be taken.
60 times.
That's what he told me. So I hope that sales validate that particular assumption. You may underline the word paradox and see how effectively that markets. Now, in terms of substance, I won't state much. And what I would say is that this is a book which deserves much more intensive discussion. And I hope that you will at some time convey perhaps a one-day event in which each of the major chapters can then be more intensively discussed. Then a lot of the empirical information can then be related to the hypothesis that you are presenting over here. Now, as far as some of the specific sectors are mentioned, which I may be more familiar with, such as the banking sector. Now, that was, for me, a very informative chapter, but it did not generate all the information that I would have been looking for if I wanted to know the issue of problems of weak institutions in banking. You see, one of the centrally, you are looking at a set of reforms arguing about the central bank's independence and autonomy and so forth. Actually, if you look at the reforms, these which were carried out in the 90s, quite a number of reforms were in place. And if you look at the figures that you gave of the decline in NPL, it would imply that some of the reforms that were taking place at that time did have positive outcomes. Now, we were pointing out when we were seeing those same results in the 1990s, that actually part of the problem is in statistical failures rather than just analytical failures. Because the whole measure of NPLs is itself not a very credible one, because all you essentially do is that you accept the central bank classification of NPLs, and you then you calculate the NPL percentages on that basis. But of course, what happened at that particular time, and has continued to happen not since then, but since 1981, is that NPLs have constantly been underreported, largely because of the whole process of loan rescheduling. And it now became a sort of built-in compulsion on the part of all bank borrowers to reschedule their loans, because once you rescheduled a loan which was not performing at all very well, it was then taken off the books. And it then no longer became an NPL, it simply became a rescheduled loan. Now, serious research would require that you look much more intensively at the books of the banks and at the balance sheets of the borrowers themselves to get an idea of how effectively loans are performing. About the only people who have actually done that, I would like to think, are myself and Syed Akhtar Mahmood, and subsequently Ahmad Hassan and then Binoy Sen. I mean, what Akhtar Mahmood did when we began looking at the NPLs of the Shilpo Bank and the Shilpo Rinshonasta way back when Mr. Ziaur Rahman was still alive, and he was the originator, you may say, of the default culture of Bangladesh, was that at that time, the World Bank was the driving force in pressing NPLs. Because the World Bank's idea was that we must develop the private sector at all costs. And the only way of actually doing this was by sort of pushing state funding and knowing what may be the outcomes for this. We will be looking this way and that way, but not actually at the balance sheets of the bank. So when these non-performing loans were being accumulated by the Shilpo Bank and the Shilpo Rinshonasta, not a word was coming out in the country economic memorandum of the World Bank in the way that they are now articulating this day in and day out in their reports. And I asked myself, what the hell is going on over here? Why are we not hearing how effectively these banks are lending and what is happening? So I hired Akhtar Mahmood. In those days, we were not privileged with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to finance our projects. So from the BIDS budget, I promised Akhtar Mahmood, who had just come out of Dhaka University, a handsome salary of 500 takas a month. And he then, on the strength of this very extravagant generosity of mine, then went to the Shilpo Bank and said, can we look at your non-performing loans khata? They didn't have any khata. So what did Akhtar Mahmood do? He then went into their godam and they gave him 400 files of the individual loans given to the borrowers of these banks. And then day in and day out, in a non-air-conditioned godam, he sat with these files and he discovered that you had NPLs, meaning to say that loans were not being paid back on schedule, to the extent of 80 to 90%. That was the time. That was the numbers he earned. Now, he could do it because he was actually looking at the number of what should have been paid back and was not paid back. NPLs don't measure that. They measure what is rescheduled. And you get a significant, a quantum reduction in the non-NPL percentage. Now, if you are willing to do that type of work, or your assistants were willing to do the work which Akhtar Mahmood actually did, you may then get a correct estimate of what an NPL actually is in Bangladesh today. Unfortunately, we do not know that. So you
alternative calculation seems almost 25% of the total loan.
Okay.
Whereas the official
But what I would tell you this is that there is a list of the 100 top defaulters, which they promised to make public, but they did not make public for year after year. When this brings us to the whole issue of transparency and opacity in the lending practices of the bank. In fact, actually, if transparency as a policy instrument were to be introduced, both into tax collections, into public expenditures, into bank defaults or bank, that would be a very major contribution which could actually be made if we could actually know and we could identify the people. But what is happening now in the NPL constituency is that there are people who were defaulting from the 1980s. And they have gone on rescheduling their loans year after year, year after year, up to 2024. So that if you were to actually add up the extent of the default, which in fact has become an interest-free loan to them, or a grant financing to these particular people, you would come up with hundreds of thousands, and if not thousands of crores of, in fact, default, which I have classified as a form of income redistribution and one of the sources of income inequality in Bangladesh. That resource transfers through the default culture, which have taken place for an elite category of people, represent a state intervention in distribution of income in Bangladesh. No one has ever brought that into the analysis today, nor have they made any estimates of then the taxes and subsidies, the way in which, in fact, they are given tax rebates and so forth. And if you add all that up, you will get a new measure of measuring income redistribution in Bangladesh today if you were wanting to go down that road. Now, all these partly represent policy failure, partly they represent institutional failure. The Bangladesh Bank's institutional failure is not originating in the rules and policy regimes that are available to them. It originates in the fact that they do not do their duty. And the most unacceptable part of not doing your duty is that it is not one is that you uniformly do not do your duty to everyone. Okay, that's one way of doing it. And you say that, all right, I'm using bank financing to subsidize a whole class of investors to promote growth in Bangladesh. But what is done is that this is a discriminatory arrangement. Some people are privileged, some people are not. Whose loan will be rescheduled, for how long it will be rescheduled, whether it will be written off, whether it will be carried over, or whether you will take legal action against it, it varies from person to person. So what you essentially have then is the fundamental breakdown of an institution, which is that it is not rule-based. I mean, the essence of institutional functioning is that it must be rule-based in a uniform way. And that means that it must apply to everyone in exactly the way that the law was in fact actually written. Now, same applies to the taxation system. Mushir Rahman was twice chairman of NBR. He knows where all the bodies are buried. He will no doubt share this with us if we in fact have a private conversation with him on the subject. But the objective reality is whose tax files are opened, how deeply they are addressed, is not rule-based. It is person-based. So the deals that you are talking about, these are deals made with hundreds of privileged individuals. They are the beneficiaries of the deals. Now, what is the outcome of this process? That no one believes that there are any rules in Bangladesh. They think that if A could make a deal, if A could get his, in terms of getting his taxes written down, if B could actually get his loans rescheduled, why can't I? What is the variable which is going to determine whether I'm going to get my loan rescheduled or not? Then you will find out, well, of course, there is always the cash element involved. We should not rule out the importance of market mechanism, as Zaidi would appreciate. And the market mechanism works exceedingly well in the functioning of the state machinery. That if everything has to now be incentivized in the state machinery, then you have a well-functioning market mechanism in Bangladesh. Maybe too well-functioning, but it is functioning. But the second issue over here then is the deals. Then who gets the deal? What do I have to do? A, I may need to have a brother-in-law, an uncle, a brother, a father, or, and now the most important element, I must be in the right political party, and preferably the ruling party. So, next in your analysis, look at the number of people who are members of parliament and look at their loans, their debt defaults. Now, every finance minister, going back to the first regime of Saifur Rahman, when we were taking him to task about this, the original law was that no defaulter would be permitted to actually contest elections. That was the hard rule. What happened? We then invited Saifur Rahman and told him, and he said, yes, well, we'll do our best on that. What actually happened? I think about 2 weeks before the elections, it was announced that anyone who makes a down payment of 5 or 10%, I forget the number, on his defaulted loan will be permitted to contest the election. And this natak then went on in every successive election, that you were given the down payment option. But what we pointed out in our dialogues after the election is that if you were permitted to contest the election on the basis of a down payment, the presumption was that you would then repay your loan eventually, because there was an implicit contract between you and the state at that point. If you were then contesting the elections on the basis of that contract, then what happens when you do not repay your loans after you are a member of parliament? And again, more research for you to follow up over here, Selim. You don't repay your loans, even if you are 4 years into parliament. there's violation of contract. You should immediately lose your seat on that basis because you have contested the election on the basis of a contractual commitment. But that does not happen. So what are we seeing then? We are then seeing a variety of discriminatory institutional interventions specific to people, specific to political identity, specific to personalized relationship, and of course, ultimately specific to market transactions. Now, look at the Anti-Corruption Commission and look at the way in which it goes about its business. I mean, looking at the way they go about their business, you would get the assumption that all our most eminent politicians and people in high office are all absolutely, clean as innocent babies. And in fact, there's nothing going on over there. Now, recently, the assets and the huge escalation in assets and incomes were published between elections prior to the elections. Now, in the normal course of things, a well-functioning anti-corruption commission and NBR would then immediately begin investigation for explanation of how this big escalation actually took place. I mean, I have not heard. I mean, maybe they are doing it, but I have not heard that they have done it. Now, what I'm trying to conclude, and I want to conclude by this, is that central to institutional failure is the departure from a rules-based system, where each institution then becomes customized to the particular deal variable, which is in fact being applied in that particular transaction. And once you get into that situation, then no one believes that there is an institution which is in fact going to give me any objective service which will be beneficial. What they will be looking for is what is the nature of the deal which will work in order for me to get benefits from that institution. Now, whilst this has been absorbed and internalized by everyone who is aspiring to or is actually doing business in Bangladesh, we should keep in mind that this has also been absorbed by the international FDI community. And if you want to get a real understanding of why FDI inflows into Bangladesh are possibly, if the last data is correct, even lower than in Pakistan, which is doing much worse than us, both governance-wise as well as development-wise. What is the problem? Why are they not coming into a 6% growth country? We should investigate the absence of a rule-based system, the absence of credible institutions which can be relied upon to serve different investors from every country in the same way as they are serving domestic investors. Now, if you ever sit down to have an extended discussion, there are many other very interesting things. You've produced a highly commendable book. I would like to congratulate you and your co-authors to put the whole issue of institutions on the table and to discuss it, derive what are appropriate policy and political conclusions from it, and more important, then deepen the research that needs to be done and to take this into its next stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for very encouraging words. And I think as Professor Sarosmani, he also spoke, and sir, there's many things which we need to discuss and elaborate. And I think we'll organize some topic-specific sessions, and we'll invite some more discussions on those topics. So time, I think we have exceeded all time. So I think I'll just give Umar just a couple of minutes, Umar. If you have any very quick reaction.
Thank you, Selim, and thank you, everyone. There's so many reactions, it will be difficult to confine them to 2 minutes, but I'll do my best. I think the first thing to say is that it's abundantly clear that the things that need to be said about institutions and Bangladesh are not confined within the covers of this book. They need a much longer, more detailed and ongoing discussion that can be informed by your insights and also by events as they unfold. Let me raise directly some important points that were made, especially by Professors Saban and Professor Osmani, both of whom talked about well-functioning institutions. Professor Saban asked why these countries wouldn't it have been good to have included examples where well-functioning institutions could have been a comparison. I should say that there were 4 case studies. There were meant to be 5. COVID got in the way. So that was one of the avenues that we were unable to explore because of certain contingent factors. However, there is a 5th volume, which is a synthesis volume, written by François and Jean-Philippe. And that explicitly addresses just this question. It doesn't look at Vietnam so much, but it looks at South Korea and Taiwan. So this very important point of institutions can be poorly functioning or well functioning is explicitly addressed. Now, Professor Osmani also made this point in a critical way, which I very much welcome as criticism, but I hope I can address it and deflect it, because if you recall, in my earlier remarks, I compared the institutional diagnostic to a growth diagnostic. Now, in a growth diagnostic, you have got a neoclassical growth model in which you only have constraints. You are simply comparing things that depart from an idealized state. Now, that is not how institutions work. Institutions constrain, but they can also enable. And built into the framework, in other words, of an institutional diagnostic, is an appreciation that sometimes you can have decisions constrained in a negative way, but in other ways, institutions can facilitate coordination. And that is very much the story that we want to tell, especially in the RMG chapter, where we are very much saying that Bangladesh has this incredible record, successful record. And we do indeed point to ways in which arrangements in the past have worked well. Professor Saban, I think, said something like central to institutional failure is a departure from a rule-based system. And I think there's a lot of truth in that remark. And it's a theme that's explored about institutions going from being well-functioning to being less well-functioning. The interesting thing is often it's the same institutions at different times. It's too complex, I think, a subject to go into in any more detail. But all I would say is I warmly welcome Professor Osmani's remarks. I think that it is something that we tried to address, but perhaps we should have explained ourselves better. As far as inductive frameworks go, what we're trying to do with this point about how institutions interact with one another is very much to see how institutional weaknesses or strengths in one area affect others. And Professor Saima Hakpadisha pointed to this with the importance of understanding the fiscal space, so that the banking sector chapters and the tax chapters are very much related to the public services, whether or not the state has the fiscal space to be able to run them properly, or whether it relies heavily on NGOs or other mechanisms of delivering these outcomes. I do take the point that the health and social side is hugely important, and that's, I think, recognized in the sense that we see this as not only an economic story, but also very much a social and a political one, in which those elements are inextricably linked. There were many other good points made, and I'm delighted that this has been recorded, and I hope that we can also follow up with you on an individual and collective basis to improve this work and hopefully keep updating it. As one of the authors pointed out, it was some time ago that the primary research on this project was made, and in my view we should keep updating it and keep these discussions going, which is, I hope, something that we can continue to organize. But in conclusion, thank you for this wonderful event. Thank you very much to Selim for Salim seems to be able to conjure these events out of nowhere and get the best people to come. And we're very lucky to have had him as our lead investigator in Bangladesh. I believe that a high tea is mentioned on your program, which sadly I won't be able to participate in myself, but I hope that you enjoy it. And thank you once again for your participation in this event.
Thank you, Umar. Thank you. We are yet to hear from our chief guest, Dr. Murshid Rahman. So he will have the final words. Please.
Thank you for inviting me to this occasion. And listening to Professor Raman Subhan is going back to classroom. As in the past, I have a limited capacity to absorb the lessons that I get. I guess I will make one or two general remarks and then go on to some specifics. One is, I think the deal making here does not necessarily carry a stigma. If you look at RMG as the beginning of this deal making, the three persons involved who had impeccable reputation for competence and integrity, an initiative for Nurul Qadir Khan, who is often mentioned. In connection with that, let me touch on one particular point, one or two. One is RMG is going into automation, which has reduced its employment impact, and that has affected the women more than men. One of the reasons they are opting for automation is the pressure on compliance with labor standards, which are partly imported, partly homegrown. That's one thing. And the second thing is the paper mentions about subcontracting, but doesn't mention about buying house. Subcontracting, I guess, is a device to escape the burden of managing very large establishments. Some of the very efficient, successful RMG factories have not been able to survive because they undertook very ambitious integration program. They succeeded as long as they could, but then they failed at some point of time. EDF these days is discussed very much in relation to IMF's computation of reserve and the Bangladesh banks, allegedly wrong computation of reserve. EDF was instituted with a World Bank credit, I think it was $70 or $75 million. One of the issues there came up, can the EDF resources be used for importing RMG's input? The bank's initial response in the course of discussion was that, no, you have access to some financing, so don't use it. From our side, it was pointed out that if we depend on back-to-back LC, then I am tied to some specific source of procuring the materials. After consulting the headquarters, they came back and said, okay, you can use it, but the condition was that this would be kind of a ring-fenced offshore operation. The loan would be given in foreign currency, repaid in foreign currency. The interest rate would be linked with LIBOR plus premium. The premium would be lower because it was all internal operation. So the exporters got a little bit advantage by borrowing. The fund was expected to grow from the repayment, but eventually what we did later was to appropriate receipts from export in order to augment this EDF. So at some point of time, it turned out that we were taking out more money from export proceeds in order to build up this EDF, but eventually that helped the exporters. Let me say something I mean, it's a kind of apology from me. I started reading the papers, and RMG was definitely the first thing I read. And I found that the people who were the leaders and pioneers either had worked under them or worked with them. Some of them were friends, some of them were acquaintances. So it's a kind of people who were leading the sector. And that kind of persuaded me to read as much of the book as I could. I jotted down points which are a little over 8 pages, and the letter size is about 1/3 of my normal writing. So I will not go into that. Hopefully, if you have an occasion to further consultation, I'll be very happy to join you. On the banking sector, there are 2 or 3 things. One is if you think of the evolution of industrial financing, we started with EPIDC, BSR, PSRS, BSB, and so on. So the expectation of the investors were that the government will somehow or other provide cheap finances. And one of the ways to make the financing cheap was to allow them to default. In the late 80s, when the first stab as reforms started, default was defined without any subjective judgment or minimizing the subjective judgment. If there's a failure to repay the loan installment for the first time, it's classified. If it fails the second time, it becomes a bad loan, and immediately you have to make a provision. So provision is a kind of signaling that something is going wrong. But as Professor Rahman Subhan has pointed out, there's a continuous rescheduling. And one of the justification for this option for 10% down payment to make someone eligible to contest the election and to get more loan was an argument from the banks that this loan is not coming back. If you if you oblige them to pay in order to contest the election, we will get some money. So there was an immediate reward in doing this, apart from whatever distortions it might have caused. I think where it does not work is after the rescheduling, the NPL as a number goes down. But if you look at it more seriously, the amount of impaired asset or toxic asset goes up. If the risk-weighted capital is to rise with the increase of toxic asset, it goes up, and the bank's fund for lending out is constrained. So you have a difficult situation where you have to keep on financing the industry, and at the same time look at the bank's health. I don't know if it is possible to meet both the objectives, and then we have to look at also the laws relating to bankruptcy. I mean, there should be an option to declare some of the enterprises become bankrupt, and then the law defines the seniority of repayment and the obligation and so on. We have not gone on to that stage. Now, I wanted to say something more, but I can't read it out now. You will find that the entrepreneurs are in the habit of continuously expanding their enterprise. One of the reasons is if you are continuously expanding your enterprise size, there's an access to further loan, and this further loan meets part of the earlier obligation, and partly there's an investment into expansion of the project. So there is an unsatiable, endless hunger for expansion, and as long as you can continue to expand, you do not have any problem. taxation, Professor Rahman Subhan said that I was twice in the NBR. Now, there is a suggestion that if NBR is given or taxation is given autonomy, it will improve. I have doubt if that will happen. The first is taxation, as it is admitted in the paper, is at the heart of politics. So you cannot leave it to an agency of the bureaucracy to determine what should be the tax rates and what should be the way to collect the taxes, which does not mean that there should not be some procedure for restraining the government or the politicians to get involved in the collection of taxes. Let me share one experience that I have. There was a very senior government servant. He had retired. I was the chairman. He came to me and he said that his enterprise that he was representing is not liable to taxation, but the tax official has imposed a few crores tax on that enterprise. And I should tell him to write off that or to forget that he would collect that tax. I told him, sir, I don't have any power. He said, no, what you say, you are then be a chairman, you have all the powers. I said, no, sir, I do not have the power. The law prescribes the authority to make assessment and collect the taxes, which has to be exercised by the tax commissioner, joint tax commissioner, and the deputy commissioner. If there is any complaint, it has to go to appellate commission, and then there is a tribunal headed by 3 persons. One of them is someone who is competent to become a judge of the High Court, but did not become a judge. If he became a judge, he would not join this tribunal. He was not convinced. And very rightly, he looked at me and laughed. And he said, what do you say? When all your predecessors have been doing it, and now you say that you don't have the power. I said, that is how I did the laws. They went to the High Court and they got the case. They won the case. So the NBR does not really have the statutory power to make any assessment or to hear appeal. It is done by these officials who are authorized by the law. NBR's main responsible is to work out the principles of taxation, to oversee that the taxes are properly collected, and to manage the tax administration. I have jotted down here a few points which I think can be the way to look at the reform program. Value-added tax or VAT. Before that, I should say that the paper says that taxation depends on the political legitimacy of the state. I think that's a very tall order. I have a very humble idea about that. The legitimacy of tax principle depends on the agreed procedures and the agreed principles of taxation, which is known to the taxpayer and to the tax collector. And this agreement provides the basis for legitimacy of taxation. If there is a weakness in this relationship, then it is very difficult to have a taxation system which works. Now, value addition tax is supposedly to be imposed at an uniform rate and collected preferably in 1 or 2 stages. If you multiply the stages of collection, it becomes more complicated, the leakage goes larger and larger. And if you have multiple rates, then the problem is much worse. It works if you have an efficient system of input credit and duty drawback, exemption, etc. for export, and input credit for domestic production and domestic consumption. Customs duty, I guess it ought to be a few slabs, maybe 4, 5, or 6, and should be consistent with the WTO's prescription of progressive reduction of protection. Supplementary duty and value-added tax are to be applied in a trade-neutral fashion. It cannot be used, ideally, for raising the level of effective protection. Then we have something called regulatory duty. I don't think regulatory duty will find any basic textbook on tax economics. It's something that we have invented and we apply it indiscriminately for raising revenue and for protection purposes also. That's something very confusing. Excise duty is admitted and there is a discretion that the government can impose any amount of any rate of excise duty, and that is admittedly for raising revenue, and it is applied also for sin. Also applied as sin tax for alcohol, for tobacco, and so on. We have something called turnover tax. Turnover tax is supposed to be at a very moderate rate. It is not meant primarily for raising revenue, but in order to recognize that someone is engaged in some business transaction. And it is helpful for the person who pays. And in a way, it adds a very little amount to the total revenue collected. But what we have done is we use turnover tax in order to raise revenue, in order to protect, and so on. So these distortions have caused a lot of problem. About income tax, we have granted too many exemptions, and these days the newspapers report NBR's intention to remove the exemptions and concessional rates. Purportedly, this is also supported by IMF. I am not very sure to what extent it is supported by IMF. What happens is, if the rates are varied with respect to the sectors, with respect to the types of business that one runs, then you provide some ad hoc benefit by reducing the tax for a particular purpose or for a particular period. The problem with this ad hoc exemption is that the investor cannot plan and cannot predict what would be his or her tax burden. So this is this is a disincentive for investment. It would be much better if the tax authorities can design a tax system where investment is given generous credit, so that they don't have to suppress information and don't pay a lot of tax if they invest. At the bottom of that problem is, how do I say it? This instinct of financial repression. If you look at the taxation, you'll find that if the financial transaction through formal channels which are documented, these are subject to multiple taxes, which is an incentive for avoiding the formal channel for taxation, which goes against intermediation, which goes against investment, which goes against savings, and so on. It doesn't serve any useful economic purpose. Land administration and the judiciary in respect of the land disposal. I have a couple of comments, but I will not go over all of them. One is the choice of Chittagong perhaps gives a wrong indication. You can come across a lot of pathology in land administration, in land-related judicial cases. Chittagong faces a very heavy pressure for demographic reasons. There are a lot of people from outside coming into Chittagong, and also development pressure. Those of you who are familiar with Chittagong, Jaidi Sattar would be one of those. You will find that from the port and the central CBR, Central Board of Railway, and beyond the old circuit house, this is not private land. this is owned by the railway board. This is owned by Chittagong Port Authority. Part of it is owned by the defense forces who have built up a hotel there. So the Chittagong people have the residual part to live in. So Chittagong city cannot expand. So there will be very severe pressure on land there, and you will have many problems and also private dispute. And I thought that in order to have an idea of how land ownership, land disposition, etc., works out, maybe it would be a good idea to pick up one or two maujas and track what is happening in those maujas. And that would give us some objective picture of what goes wrong and what is wrong with the land administration and dispute resolution. Now, why this land becomes such a problem? You will find that in 1950 or so, we had this Land State Acquisition Act, whereby the government assumed the responsibility that was earlier exercised by the jamindars. There was not much of opposition to that because the big jamindars had already left. So it was an easy reform to do. Then we have in 1947-50, sorry, that was the migration time. Then we have Enemy Property Act in 1965. The Hindu property was declared enemy property, and you cannot sell, you cannot do anything with respect to that land. One of the fallout of that was something called in the revenue administration, the abbreviation is DCR, duplicate carbon receipt. You pay the yearly tax and you get the permission to possess and use that piece of land. It continues for 10 years, 15 years. Every year you pay the tax and you build up some structure. And that gets you into a problem when the land is acquired for some development purpose. In 1971, again, there was the vested property. So all of these were combined into vested property with restrictions on their use and their sales. And you have talked about land register, land mapping, etc., land survey. Bangladesh survey, you say that it started in 1970 and is still continuing. There's a kind of miscommunication perhaps, or I didn't see it properly. This countrywide survey starts at some corner. In this case, it started with Chittagong. Hill Tracks was outside it. It started with Chittagong. I understand the Zaidi was a trainee in that survey in 1970 or maybe 71. And it ends up at the other point. So it goes to northwest and it will end up somewhere in Dinaspur or Thakurgaon in some such places, continues for a long time. Now, what do they do in the survey? Those who measure the land and look at the records, they announce that they will go to a particular mauza or a particular place on a particular date. The evidence is communicated to them verbally. Somebody turns up and says, this land is mine, this land is my father's, I have inherited this, and so on. They record it. If you want to change it, you have to go through the judicial procedure. Now, you make a record on the basis of a verbal statement without checking the documents of your ownership or your possession. But that becomes so authentic that in order to change that, you have to go through the judicial procedure. Now, there's a reference to Balam book, Balam. That's something interesting. Did you ever try to understand what is Balam? Volume. So there are two volumes. One is the record of the state land, and the other is the private land. You write the transfer deeds and any documents in your hand. I think it is because when it started, The type machines were not used or not known, not to speak of computer. One interesting thing is you cannot cross out anything that you have made, anything which you have wrongly written. You have to point out that it is mistake. Write separately the correct statement. In some sense, it is the beginning of the blockchain. You can't edit. EPZ, I'm not very sure if EPZ should be treated as an instance of the complexity of land administration or as a problem of industrial policy. Because it is supposed to provide unencumbered serviced land to the investors. And it suffers all the problems that you have with respect to land acquisition or land disposition. Srihotto also I didn't quite understand. There's a reference that the acquisition was done under 1982 Acquisition Act. 2017 acquisition law, requisition acquisition law, that provides for compensation 3 times the value of the land in that moja. There's a reference that the sub-register determines it, rightly so, but not also rightly so. The sub-register has the data of the value of the land transfers in that moja, and it goes only for the recent years, maybe 2 years or 3 years. What happens in a land scarce situation, if you acquire someone's land, he may lose his occupation, he may lose his main source of income, and the moment you acquire land for some project of significance, the land price of that area goes up. So subjectively starts thinking in terms of the appreciation of the value that takes place once he loses his land. That kind of causes a lot of pain. Srihotto, you said that it started in 1982 and the compensation has not yet been paid. I guess what might have happened is that the acquisition was completed under the 1982 law. Before the compensation was paid, this 2017 compensation law came in. So at the time he would be paid compensation, it's a new law. It's a general practice in any amendment of the law that when a new law is introduced in the place of the old one, it says that the proceedings which were under the old law will be deemed to be undertaken under the revised or the new law. So they would be entitled to compensation under the new law. That may be a subtle legal point which the court can decide. I cannot. I can only say that how it works. There's also a suggestion that an industrial policy which looks at the whole thing should be in principle, that's a right kind of suggestion. If you look at a special advantage from the government, it contains a lot of principles like it would be subjected to low tax, it would be given cheap loan, and so on. So once you have that industrial policy in place, for the investor, at least for the smart investors, it becomes a ground for him to go to the bank and say, look here, it is the policy of the government, you have to give me this loan. If you don't give me this loan, he would have access to others and complain that this bank is not implementing your policy. There is a recommendation that the autonomy to the central bank perhaps or is expected to solve all the problem. I have doubt. I wish Wahiduddin Mahmood was present. Wahid and I were on the central bank's board at the same time, and Wahid continued after I had left the government service. Now, a few things that we can consider is look at the composition of the board. Right now, the board is composed of civil servants ex officio. He might have studied anthropology or he might have studied history. And by virtue of his current position, senior official, he becomes a member. He may be least interested in the bank's operation. Pardon?
Least interested, but even less capable.
Well, I mean, they are my former colleagues. I would not say they are less capable. I mean, if Wahiduddin was there, I would not say that they are not capable.
No, I mean,
Now, you see, so when Wahiduddin I was there, we insisted that at least in 1 quarter, they should submit, the bank officials should present to the board the policies and the performance in respect of monetary supply and credit, etc., to the board. They started doing it, but the board remained interested in the administration and operational part of the central bank. I mean, who is getting promotion, who has done something wrong, why action is not being taken against some person. We had the most capable economist on the board, Aminul Islam, who was in the ADB. But Aminul Islam also somehow got interest in the bank's administration. I mean, he had very heavy files, but before he could complete it, unfortunately, he died. The second is the central bank deals with a lot of refinancing to the favored sectors. Now, I think we'll not disagree that the selection of the thrust sectors, so the selection of which sectors are to be supported, should be a decision of the government, not of the central bank. The central bank then acts as an agent of the government. So automatically the government has a role in terms of what is being done by the central bank, at least in respect of the refinancing. And the refinancing schemes are quite a few refinancing schemes that they have. The central bank, and also it applies to other regulatory agencies that we have, are in a sense without any accountability, or they're accountable only to the executive branch of the government. They do not have any other kind of accountability. My suggestion would be that we consider that the central bank publishes periodic report, not as they want to, but some kind of format is developed so that they provide the necessary information. They will be free to include their observation, their comments, but the data should be prescribed and it should be preferably supported by a performance audit, which should be made publicly available. That kind of and also their internal professional capacity has to improve. They have an very deeply ingrained resistance to anything coming from outside. In the 1980s, they were given an official with the rank of a deputy governor, one of the brightest students that Professor Sawan had taught, Rohim. He had done his PhD from UCLA, Bartley, most probably. So he was appointed to do something with the bank and had the rank of a deputy governor. So there was a resistance there against him, and eventually he had to leave. And the bank converted it to another position of a deputy governor. So someone had the right to promotion. We have now a position of a chief economist currently vacant. And the immediate past chief economist was someone from the bank who headed the research department, who was part of the research department. Now, the chief economist coming from outside can bring a fresh outlook, and also someone who also can bring new knowledge and new exposure. But then the point is, how does he relate to the bank's research department, and how the research department's output gets an input into the policy? That is not very clear. The present governor has taken a very commendable initiative. He has set up a monetary policy advisory group. But this group is a kind of initiative taken by the governor without being integrated in the bank's structure. So it sort of hangs loosely on the bank and without any effective influence on the bank except what the governor thinks ought to be done. And to what extent their advice should be taken into account in making policy. Some statutory recognition of this advisory committee and again, not choosing them ex officio, but choosing them by their competence, which will create a lot of controversy. But even then, maybe it would be an improvement. I guess those are the few things which I thought I thought I would mention. Reducing my 8+ pages note about corruption.
Which page are you now?
I am on the protocol. No, one is I think this deal was used in an innocent way. It could be corruption, it can be without corruption. But corruption to me looks like a black box. If we can't find out what is happening, we say that, okay, there must be corruption, there must be some dishonest deal between someone in office and someone benefiting the office. So we should be very clear about the use of the term deal and not necessarily connecting it with corruption. Economists in the growth accounting, they have something called total factor productivity. When they can't account for the factors of production, they say, okay, is there the solo residual? So this corruption becomes a kind of total failure package. It is failing, there must be something wrong, something corrupt, something bad. About bureaucracy, I think we should look at the way we build our bureaucracy should be more carefully looked at. It's very difficult to change it overnight, but the recruitment, training, their career, they move horizontally. They work in a place for 2 years, 3 years, move on to something else, maybe completely unrelated. And when they move up, they might be discharging responsibility for which they did not have any significant prior experience. So the bureaucracy is a difficult proposition in our situation, and one had to look at it very carefully. As some of you said, that you look at the small elements of efficiency and responsibility that you can bring in. Maybe we should try to bring it within the present bureaucracy without trying to overhaul it completely. About industrial policy, and I think about industrial policy, 2 things maybe, as Professor Rahman Subhan has mentioned, we should look at Chinese and Korean experience, maybe experience of 1 or 2 other countries. Comparative advantage as it exists at any point of time limits the possibility of moving into new direction. So some element of risk, some element of judgment has to be there in order to identify what are the new areas which can respond to the skill that we can build up. The present skill may not justify some investment, but if we look at our education system, if we can improve the education system, we can also look at the more complex production process, which will be a step towards further diversification. And I hope finally that you have some occasion for more detailed discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. We are sincerely grateful to our distinguished guest here today, and also the participants who have joined this, I think, a very thought-provoking and rich discussion. And in some cases, the discussions actually are giving us new food for thoughts. And I'm quite sure Umar would also agree with me that we want to carry this discussion forward, and as well as some of the points Professor Rehman, he suggested some of the areas of further research, and we'll also look into those issues quite seriously. And thank you so much, sir, Rehman sir, Mushir sir, and Osmani sir, and the audience, of course. So we invite you for tea, and then we invite you for the next event of Salam as well. Thank you.